Your father may own this building, she someday. Her voice steady, despite the coffee still dripping from her apron. But he cannot buy you a single ounce of character. The diner went silent. Every fork stopped moving. And in the back booth, 17 men in leather vests slowly set down their cups. If you believe that money should never give anyone the right to destroy another person's dignity, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the notification bell and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning started the way most summer mornings started at the Desert Rose Diner, loud, hot, and busy in the way that only a Route 66 roadside institution can be busy. The coffee machine ran without stopping. The ceiling fans pushed warm air around in slow, lazy circles. The smell of bacon, grease, and pancake batter had soaked itself so deep into the walls over the years that Ruth Mercer, the diner's 71-year-old owner, once said she believed the building itself was hungry. Audrey Collins had been on her feet since 5:30 in the morning. She worked the morning shift 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when they were shorthanded, which was often. She tied her blonde hair in a low ponytail before every shift because it kept it out of her face when things got moving fast, and things always got moving fast by 6:15. She carried herself with the kind of efficiency that came from years of doing difficult work without complaint, not because she had no complaints, but because the floor didn't care about your complaints. The tables needed wiping. The coffee needed refilling. The customers needed attending to, whether they deserved your best patience or not. She had bills. She had her brother Mason to think about. Mason Collins was 42 years old and had spent the better part of 18 years as an Army-trained mechanic, first in the service and then at a warehouse distribution facility outside Red Mesa. He was the kind of man who could rebuild an engine from stripped parts and make it run better than factory spec, who fixed neighbors' cars on weekends for whatever they could afford to pay him, who never once complained about the work being beneath him. Then a support beam failed at the warehouse failed because 3 separate safety inspections had flagged it as structurally compromised, and the reports had somehow never made it to the people who could authorize repairs. And Mason fell 12 feet onto a concrete floor. He broke his right hip, cracked 2 vertebrae, and fractured his left wrist, badly enough that 3 surgeries hadn't fully restored the mobility he needed. He was still recovering. The medical bills were not. So Audrey worked doubles when doubles were available. She saved what she could. She smiled at customers who didn't smile back. She refilled coffee for people who never said thank you. She did all of this because she was the kind of woman who understood that the world didn't slow down because your situation was hard, and that the only thing standing between her brother's recovery and complete financial collapse was her continued employment at a diner that paid her a reasonable wage and allowed her to keep her dignity intact while she earned it. She was carrying a full breakfast tray to table 7 when the front door opened. She didn't look up immediately. She rarely did. You learned, after enough years of waitressing, to register a new customer's entry in the background of your awareness without redirecting your attention until you'd finished what you were doing. Dropping a tray because you got distracted by a new arrival was the kind of rookie mistake that cost you time, cost Ruth money, and cost your regulars their patience. But she felt the shift in the room. It was subtle, the way a conversation at the counter dropped half a volume, the way 2 of her regular customers exchanged a quick look. Audrey set the plates down at table 7, thanked the couple there, and turned toward the front. Preston Vale walked into the Desert Rose Diner like he'd already decided he owned it. He was 4 years old, dressed in linen pants and a shirt that cost more than Audrey made in a week. And he moved with the particular kind of loose confidence that came from spending your entire life in rooms where everyone already knew who your father was. He had 3 friends with him, 2 other young men, dressed in similar expensive casual wear, and a woman in a sundress who was already holding up her phone to film the interior of the diner with the expression of someone cataloging a curiosity rather than experiencing a meal. "I told you it was exactly what I said it was," Preston announced to his friends. loud enough for half the diner to hear. A Route 66 ditch stop, a historical artifact. You practically have to be an archaeologist to eat here. One of his friends laughed. The woman with the phone panned across the counter stools and the collection of vintage license plates Ruth had mounted on the back wall. Audrey watched this for exactly 2 seconds. Then she picked up her order pad and walked over. "Good morning," she said. "I'll get you settled." "Four?" Preston looked at her the way some people look at a door handle as an instrument, not a person. "Booth?" he said. "That table's reserved until 8:30, Audrey said. "I can seat you at the one right next to it. Same view, same space." "I didn't ask which one was reserved. I said I want the one by the window." Audrey kept her expression professional. "I understand that. But that booth is held for a customer who has it booked. I'm happy to—" "Do you know who my father is?" Preston said it the way people say it when they believe the answer will solve the problem. His friends had stopped their private conversation and were watching now. "I don't," Audrey said, "but it doesn't change which table is available." There was a beat of silence. Preston stared at her. Then he smiled, not a warm smile. The kind that signals good humor, but the kind that signals a decision has been made and the other party isn't going to like it. "We'll take the reserved one," he said. "Go ahead and unreserve it." In the back of the diner, 17 men occupied the wide rear section that Ruth kept open for large groups. They had come in just after 6, filed in the way they always did when they rode together in a loose, relaxed formation, boots on the hardwood, the sound of leather and low voices settling into the space, like weather moving in. They were members of the Hells Angels, the Red Mesa chapter, and they had been on the road since 4 in the morning to complete a charity ride for injured veterans. Most of them were tired. All of them were hungry. They ordered in bulk eggs, pancakes, stacks of toast, coffee by the pot, and they settled into the booths with the easy familiarity of people who'd eaten in 100 roadside diners exactly like this one. Their road captain sat at the end of the long center table. Wade Callahan was 53 years old, though he carried it the way weathered wood carries age with grain and density rather than fragility. His hair had gone mostly gray, with enough blonde left in it that you could see what color it used to be. His face had the kind of texture that came from decades of wind, sun, and a refusal to stay indoors when there was something worth doing outside. He'd been riding with the Hells Angels for 28 years, and before that, he'd spent 6 years in the Marine Corps. He was not a large man in the way that demanded tension by size alone, but he had a quality of stillness about him that tended to make other people's noise feel louder in contrast. He heard Preston's voice before he saw him. He didn't look up right away. He poured more coffee from the pot. Ruth had left at the end of their table and listened to the tone of the young man's voice, the particular cadence of entitlement operating without breaks, and he took a slow drink. Then he looked up and found Audrey, tracking the expression on her face rather than the words in the argument, and he read what he needed to know from the way she was holding herself. Shoulders squared, jaw controlled, the professional mask fully engaged over something that wanted to break through it. He set his cup down. "Let it breathe," he said quietly to the table around him, not looking away from the front of the diner. His voice was low enough that only the bikers nearest him could hear. "Nobody moves yet." The man to his left, a broad-shouldered former Marine named Decker, who had forearms the size of most people's thighs, nodded once and went back to his eggs. Audrey walked Preston Vale and his friends to the unreserved booth. He complained about it immediately. "The view's completely different," he said, sitting down with the posture of someone who'd been insulted. "This isn't what I asked for." "The view is the same street," Audrey said. "What can I get you to start? Coffee?" "Juice, coffee. And make sure it's actually hot this time. The last time I was in a place like this, they served me something that was barely warmer than tap water, Aubrey." "It'll be hot," Audrey said. She brought the coffee in under 2 minutes. Preston picked up the cup, took one sip, and set it back down with a deliberate clatter against the saucer. "This is burnt," he said. Audrey picked up the cup and smelled it. The coffee was dark roasted, which was how Ruth had always ordered the beans, and it was fresh brewed within the last 20 minutes. It was not burnt. It was simply stronger than what he was used to. It's our regular roast, she said. I can bring you the lighter blend if you'd prefer. What I'd prefer is that you made fresh coffee instead of serving people whatever's been sitting in the pot since dawn. This was brewed at 6:40, Audrey said. It's 6:58. One of his friends snickered. Preston's jaw tightened. Just bring something that doesn't taste like motor oil, he said. Audrey went to the kitchen, brought back the lighter roast, and set it on the table without a word. Preston's friends placed their orders without incident. Preston himself changed his order 3 times, first eggs Benedict, then a steak and eggs when he was told they didn't have hollandaise, then scrambled eggs after asking 3 separate questions about how the steak was cooked that suggested he was going to find a reason to send it back, regardless. Audrey wrote it all down, confirmed the final order, and walked away without giving him the reaction he was looking for. The woman with the phone was filming again. Audrey noticed it but said nothing. In the back, Wade was watching. Who is he? Decker asked, quietly enough. Trouble that doesn't know it's trouble yet, Wade said. He picked up his fork again. Give it time. The food came out right. Audrey checked back at the 4-minute mark, which was her standard long enough for the customers to have started eating and formed an opinion, not so long that a problem had been sitting unaddressed. Preston's scrambled eggs were exactly what he'd ordered. She could see that at a glance. He told her they were wrong. I said soft scramble, he said, pushing the plate a few inches toward her. These are overcooked. Audrey looked at the eggs. They were soft scramble. I can have them remade, she said, but these are prepared soft. The center is still, are you arguing with me? He leaned back in the booth with an expression of theatrical disbelief, turning to his friends. She's arguing with me about my own order. I'm describing what's on the plate, Audrey said. Her voice was still even. Take them back. She took them back. The cook, a quiet man named Hector, who had worked at the Desert Rose for 11 years, looked at the returned plate, looked at Audrey, and said nothing. He made a new plate. He handed it to Audrey with the careful dignity of someone who'd seen this situation before and understood exactly what it cost the person carrying it. Preston ate 2 bites of the second plate and declared them acceptable. His friends were watching Audrey now. Not with Preston's contempt, it was closer to curiosity. The slightly uncomfortable observation of people who weren't sure if what they were witnessing was normal or if they should say something. The woman with the phone had lowered it for the first time. Then Preston snapped his fingers. The sound carried across the diner like a cracked 2 sharp snaps aimed at Audrey from across the room the way you'd call a dog. A man at the counter stiffened. An older woman at a table near the door looked up from her newspaper. Audrey stopped walking, closed her eyes for a fraction of a second that no one could have clocked, and turned around. She walked back to the table. Was there something else? She said. Refill, Preston said, holding up his cup without looking at her. She filled it. She walked away. He snapped again before she'd taken 4 steps. My friends. She turned back. She refilled his friends' cups. She was 3 steps away from the table when his voice followed her again, not a snap this time, but a comment directed at his friends, loud enough to be theatrical. You tip based on the performance, he said. And the performance so far hasn't been particularly impressive. One of his friends shifted in the seat, visibly uncomfortable. The woman with the phone set it face down on the table. Wade put down his fork. At the back table, the quiet shifted. The bikers who'd been eating with the relaxed focus of tired men who'd earned a meal were becoming something else, not loud, not aggressive, just present in a different way. A younger biker named Cole, 29 years old with a mechanic's hands and a short fuse he'd spent years learning to manage, looked at Wade with a question in his expression. Wade shook his head once. Cole looked back at his plate. He's performing, Wade said, low and even. Performing needs an audience. We're not his audience yet. The critical moment arrived quietly, the way most moments that change a room do not with a fanfare, but with a single ordinary exchange that lands wrong. Preston made a comment about Audrey's figure. He directed it at his friends, but he made no effort to lower his voice. It was the kind of comment constructed specifically to make the subject aware she'd been discussed evaluative, dismissive, deliberately degrading. His friend with the phone picked it back up and pointed it at Audrey. Audrey was carrying a full coffee pot and a small plate of toast to the table beside theirs. She set the items down for the other customers, thanked them, and turned to face Preston's table. She did not pick up her order pad. She did not smile. She looked at him, directly at him, with the kind of eye contact that does not look for a fight, but does not flinch from one either. "I'm going to ask you not to do that," she said. "Do what?" He spread his hands in an exaggerated gesture of innocence for the phone. "Make comments about me that are designed to embarrass me in front of my customers." Her voice was completely steady. "I'm here to take your order and make sure your meal is right. That's what I'm doing. It doesn't entitle you to say anything you want about me while I'm doing it." The diner had been loud, with the background noise of a busy breakfast. It wasn't anymore. Preston tilted his head with a small smile. "You know what I love," he said. "A waitress who thinks she can establish terms." "I'm not establishing terms," Audrey said. "I'm asking you to behave like a decent person." Preston's smile went flat. His friends had gone quiet around him. "My father," he said, "is Graham Vale. His company is in the process of acquiring several properties on this block, including this building. So I'd think very carefully about your tone." Audrey held his gaze for a moment that stretched past comfortable. Then she said, quietly and without heat, "Your father may be able to buy this building someday, but he cannot buy you a single ounce of character." The room was completely still. The woman with the phone had stopped recording. She was just sitting there. Preston's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: surprise, humiliation, and then the hard, cold resolution that humiliation becomes when pride refuses to absorb it. He picked up his coffee cup and let it tip sideways onto the table. Not a spill, a drop. Deliberate. The coffee spread across the formica and ran over the edge in a slow stream. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a handful of bills, and pushed them into the coffee puddle. He looked at Audrey. "Clean it up," he said. Audrey did not move. The older woman by the door had stood up from her table. The man at the counter had turned fully around on his stool. 3 tables of regular customers were watching with the taut attention of people who understand they are witnessing something that has passed the point of ordinary bad behavior. "Clean it up," Preston said again, slower, each word separated for emphasis. A chair moved at the back of the diner. Not many chairs. 1. But it moved with a sound that carried the specific sound of a heavy wooden chair being pushed back from a table by someone who is done sitting down, and in the silence of the room, it was as clear as a bell. Wade Callahan stood up. He didn't come forward yet. He stood at the end of the rear table with his coffee cup in one hand, and he watched Preston Vale with the expression of a man deciding something. His 17 companions did not move, but they had stopped eating. And the quality of their stillness was different from the stillness of the other customers. It was chosen stillness, the kind that belongs to people who know how to be still and understand exactly what it costs them to remain that way. Preston glanced toward the back of the diner. He took in the leather vests, the road-worn faces, the sheer number of men who had all gone quiet at the same moment. Something crossed his expression, a flicker, not quite fear but adjacent to it, and then his pride reasserted itself and smoothed it over. He looked back at Audrey. "You have a job to do," he said. Audrey looked at the coffee spreading across the table. She looked at the money pushed into the mess. She looked at Preston Vale. "Your father's name doesn't clean that up," she said. "And I don't think yours will either." She picked up her cloth and began wiping the table, not because he'd intimidated her, but because the coffee would stain the formica if it sat, and the formica belonged to Ruth, and Ruth had kept that diner standing through 40 years of difficult customers with the same quiet determination that Audrey intended to carry out of this building with her dignity intact. Preston watched her. His jaw was set. His friends were watching him now, not her, and he felt it. He picked up his phone and pointed it at her. "Keep going," he said. "This is great content, Preston." It was the woman with the sundress, quietly, with a warning in it. He didn't look at her. He kept filming. "My father's company," he said. loud enough for the whole room, is going to own this building by fall. Every person who works here should probably start thinking about their next employment situation. Just a friendly heads up. The man at the counter stood up from his stool. He was about 60, with a rancher's build and a face that had spent decades outdoors. He walked from the counter to a point approximately 4 feet from Preston's table and stopped. "Boy," he said, and the single word carried the weight of everything the diner had just witnessed. "I've been eating breakfast here for 31 years. Ruth Mercer has fed half this town at a loss when they needed it. You don't get to come in here and talk about her business while you're sitting in her booth." Preston turned the phone toward the man. "And who are you exactly?" "Nobody who needs to explain himself to you." Wade set his cup down. He said, without raising his voice, "Preston." The use of his name stopped everything. Preston turned. He hadn't introduced himself to anyone in the diner. The gray-haired man in the back booth was looking at him across the length of the room with absolute calm. "How do you?" Preston began. "Your friend introduced you when you walked in," Wade said. "I'm a good listener." He looked at Audrey. "You all right?" Audrey straightened up from the table. She looked at Wade at this man she'd served coffee to 20 minutes ago, who had tipped generously, said please and thank you, called her by name after reading her name tag, and eaten his breakfast with the uncomplicated appetite of a man at peace with his own conduct. "I'm fine," she said. "You sure? I've handled difficult customers before." Wade nodded slowly. Then he looked at Preston again. "She said she's fine. That means we're all still being polite about this." He pulled out his phone and set it on the table in front of him. "But I want you to know we've been polite." Preston stared at him. "Is that a threat?" "It's a statement of fact." Wade's voice was entirely without aggression. "We came in here for breakfast after a charity ride. We're trying to finish our meal and leave Ruth a good tip because she's been feeding us for years. You're interrupting that." He looked at the phone on the table. "And so is the thing you're doing with your phone." Preston laughed. "Are you serious?" "Generally, yes," Wade said. "Do you have any idea who your father is?" Wade said. "Yes. Graham Vale, real estate. Has about 4 properties under negotiation on this block." He picked up his coffee cup and took a drink. "We do our reading." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. Preston's friends were looking at each other now. The woman in the sundress had put her phone in her purse. The older gentleman from the counter had returned to his stool, but had not resumed his breakfast. "You should leave," Preston said. The bluster in his voice had acquired an edge, not of confidence, but of a person trying to sound confident when the room has stopped cooperating. "You should leave and mind your own business." "We'll leave when we've finished our breakfast," Wade said pleasantly. "Ruth deserves the business." He nodded toward Audrey. "And she deserves to finish her shift without someone treating her like she's less than human." Preston pushed back from the table. "I want to speak to the owner." Audrey looked toward the back, where Ruth had appeared in the kitchen doorway, a small woman with white hair and wire-rimmed glasses, 61 years in Red Mesa on her face, who had been watching for the last 3 minutes from precisely the angle that let her see everything without being seen. Ruth walked out. She did not walk fast and she did not walk slow. She walked the way she always walked, with the considered pace of someone who has learned that a diner lives or dies by the quality of its welcome, and who has also learned that a welcome does not require the sacrifice of self-respect. She stopped at the edge of Preston's table. "I'm Ruth Mercer," she said. "I own this restaurant. I also own the lease and have for 41 years. What can I help you with?" Preston looked at her with the expression of a person recalibrating. He had expected either a confrontation or a capitulation. Ruth's expression offered neither. "Your waitress was rude to me," he said. "My waitress told you a table was unavailable and asked you not to make demeaning comments about her appearance," Ruth said. "I was listening." She tilted her head. "Was there a specific concern you had about the food?" "The food was fine," one of Preston's friends said, quietly. Preston shot him a look. "The food was fine," Preston said, as though the admission cost him something. "That's not the point." "What is the point?" Ruth said. Preston opened his mouth. He closed it. He had started this morning from a position that he had assumed was unassailable: his father's name, his father's money, his father's pending acquisition of property that included the building under his feet. He had assumed those things made him untouchable. He was discovering, in real time, that the woman standing in front of him had never, for one moment, in 41 years, allowed those things to be the deciding factor in her restaurant. "The point," Preston said, and there was something fraying at the edge of his voice now, "is that I am going to have a conversation with my father about the timeline for this acquisition. And when that happens, Ruth said, "You're welcome to come back and have breakfast." She looked at him with the uncomplicated clarity of a woman who has survived 4 decades of difficult customers and a real estate market that had tried to price her out 3 separate times. "Right now, I'd appreciate it if you paid your bill and had a pleasant rest of your day." Preston stood up. He was taller than Ruth by nearly a foot. He looked down at her with his jaw clenched and his pride fully engaged in the process of trying to recover something it had already lost. Then he looked at Audrey. "I'll be back," he said. "And the next time I come in here, it'll be as the owner." He dropped a $50 bill on the table without looking at it and walked toward the door. His friends followed. The woman in the sundress paused at the threshold and looked back at Audrey with an expression that was difficult to interpret, not quite an apology, but not quite not one either. Then she was gone. The door swung shut behind them. The diner held its breath for a moment. Then the man at the counter picked up his fork. The couple at table 7 resumed their conversation. The ordinary sounds of a working morning cutlery, coffee, the hiss of the kitchen came back like air, returning to a room. Wade picked up his cup. "Audrey," he called, across the diner, in the easy register of a man talking to someone he respects. She looked at him. "You did real well," he said. She nodded once. She picked up her order pad. She went back to work. But Wade did not pick his fork back up. He sat with his coffee and looked at the door through which Preston Vale had just walked. And he thought about what he had seen and what it meant and what was likely to come next. Because a man who leaves a room like that still unresolved, still convinced that his father's name is the last word in any argument, does not stay gone. He comes back. They always come back. And when Preston Vale came back, Wade intended to be ready. Across the table, Decker pushed his empty plate to one side and said, quietly, "He's going to be a problem." "He already is," Wade said. "The question is whether we get to be the solution." He looked toward the window where the morning sun was pressing hard against the glass, and the Route 66 blacktop shimmered with the first heat of the day, and he thought about a 24-year-old kid who had never in his life been made to answer for anything he did. And he thought about what that kind of life produces and what it takes to produce something different. He thought about the $50 bill sitting in a coffee puddle on a table. Audrey Collins was already wiping clean. A man who throws money at the things he breaks, Wade thought, has never once had to pick up the pieces himself. That was about to change. Preston Vale had been gone for 11 minutes when he came back through the door. Audrey was in the middle of clearing table 3 when she heard it, not a knock, not a polite entry, but the particular sound of a door being pushed open by someone who has spent the last 11 minutes in a parking lot talking himself back into the version of himself that believes he wins every room he walks into. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished stacking the plates, set them on her tray, and then she turned. He was alone this time. His friends were visible through the front window, leaning against a car that cost more than Audrey made in a year, watching through the glass with the cautious attention of people who weren't sure what they were about to witness, but had agreed to witness it anyway. The woman in the sundress was looking at her phone. The 2 young men were looking at the door. Preston walked to the counter and sat down on a stool directly in Audrey's path. "I want to talk to you," he said. "I'm working," Audrey said. "I know you're working. I'm sitting at the counter. That makes me a customer, which means you have to talk to me." She set the tray on the service ledge and looked at him. His jaw was still set with the residue of pride that had walked out the door 20 minutes ago and hadn't quite recovered its shape. But there was something else in his face now. something she hadn't expected. He wasn't drunk. She'd assumed when he first came in that the group had been drinking, but his eyes were clear. This was just who he was. That was somehow worse. "What can I get you?" she said. "Nothing." He put his elbows on the counter. "I want to apologize." Audrey looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said carefully. "I came on a little strong earlier," he said. "My father's in the middle of a deal, and there's pressure on, and he stopped. Something in Audrey's expression had shifted, and he felt it, and it disrupted the script he'd been rehearsing in the parking lot. "I'm trying to apologize." "You said you came on a little strong," Audrey said. "You spilled your coffee deliberately, pushed money into the mess, and told me to clean it up. You filmed me doing it. You told the entire diner that your father was going to put us all out of work. That's not coming on a little strong. That's something else." Preston's jaw tightened. "I said I was apologizing." "I heard you." She picked up her tray. "But an apology that minimizes what happened isn't really an apology. It's a request for the other person to pretend it wasn't as bad as it was. So you're not going to accept it." "I didn't say that. I'm saying if you want to apologize, apologize for what actually happened." Behind her, she heard Ruth appear in the kitchen doorway. She didn't look. She didn't need to. Preston stared at the counter. His hands were flat on the formica. He was quiet, for a moment quiet, in a way that was different from the entitled silence he'd been using all morning, which was the silence of a person waiting for everyone else to rearrange themselves around him. This was the silence of a person who didn't know what came next. "I filmed you cleaning the floor," he said slowly. "Yes." He stopped again. "Degrading," Audrey said, without heat. "The word you're looking for is degrading." In the back of the diner, Wade had not moved. He'd ordered a second round of coffee for the table, and the rest of the Hells Angels were finishing the last of their breakfast at the pace of men who had nowhere urgent to be and had silently agreed, without any of them saying so, that they weren't going anywhere until this was finished. Cole, the youngest of them at the table, had turned sideways in his booth so he could see the counter clearly without being obvious about it. Decker was reading a menu he'd already finished ordering from. Wade was watching Preston's hands. A man's hands told you things his face tried to hide. Preston's hands were flat on the counter, not gripping, not fisted. He wasn't building towards something physical. He was actually sitting still. Wade exhaled slowly through his nose. "He's not done," he said, to no one in particular. "Which part of not done?" Decker said, without looking up from the menu. "The part where he decides which version of himself he actually is," Wade said. Preston said, "I'm sorry I filmed you." Audrey stopped walking. She turned back. She looked at him, at this young man who had, for the last hour, done everything in his power to make her feel small, and who was now sitting at her counter with something on his face that she hadn't seen there before. It wasn't remorse exactly. It was something younger than remorse, something that didn't yet know what it was. "Thank you," she said. And because she was who she was, because she had learned in 28 years of living that grace costs you something and costs the other person something different, and that both of those costs matter, she set her tray down again and stood in front of him. "Your father's company," she said. "Are they really looking at this building?" Something shifted in his face. He hadn't expected the question. He'd expected the forgiveness to close the loop, and instead she'd opened a new door. "He's looking at the block," Preston said. "The diner is part of it. Does Ruth know?" He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Audrey said, "Does Ruth know?" "She's been approached," he said, "through the company's regional director. I think there were some conversations about zoning." Audrey felt the cold move through her before she understood exactly why. It was the particular cold that comes when a bad thing you suspected turns out to be a worse thing than you suspected. "What kind of zoning conversations?" she said. "I don't know the details," but something in the way he said it a fraction of a second too practiced told her that he knew more details than he was offering. She picked up her tray. "I need to finish my shift," she said. Audrey, she stopped. He'd used her name. Not the tone that orders, the tone that asks. "If something's happening with the building," he said, "it wouldn't be the worst thing. My father's company does good development. The block would. This block doesn't need development, Audrey said quietly. It needs to be left alone. She walked toward the kitchen. At the door she paused without turning around. You should tell your father's director that Ruth Mercer has been on this street for 41 years and she's not the kind of woman who responds well to pressure. Whoever he sent to talk to her about zoning, they should know that. She went into the kitchen. Preston sat at the counter for a moment. Then he got up and walked out. Wade watched him go. Then he pulled out his phone and sent a text to a number he hadn't used in about 3 weeks. The response came back in under a minute. He read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the table and poured himself more coffee. We're staying for lunch, he said to Decker. Decker looked up from the menu. I figured, he said. The morning moved the way mornings move in roadside diners and waves. The breakfast crowd thinning and then the mid-morning stragglers arriving. The coffee going from fresh to reheated. The kitchen cycling down from its peak intensity to the steady lower hum of a place that never fully stops. Audrey worked through it the same way she always did, methodical, present, professional. But something had changed in the architecture of the morning, and she felt it in the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm, not the storm itself, but the certainty that it is coming. She was bringing a check to table 9 when the door opened again. Not Preston this time. 2 men she didn't recognize, both in business casual, both with the particular bearing of people who consider themselves important and expect that to be understood without explanation. The one in front was about 45, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now mostly just well-maintained. He wore a watch that caught the light in a way that suggested it had been purchased to be noticed. He looked at the diner with the expression of a person assessing square footage. Is the owner available? He said to the room in general, which was the kind of question that assumed the room was obligated to answer. Ruth walked out of the kitchen. She looked at the 2 men the way she looked at everything, clearly, directly, without performance. I'm Ruth Mercer, she said. What can I do for you? Colton Reese, the man said, extending a hand. Vale Development, Regional Director. I think we've spoken on the phone. Ruth shook his hand without warmth. We have, she said. I told you on the phone what I'll tell you now. The building isn't for sale. Mrs. Mercer, I think there may be some aspects of the situation that we haven't fully communicated. You communicated them fine, Ruth said. I understood them. Wade was listening from the back. So was every biker at the long table. None of them moved, but the stillness had changed quality again. It had become the kind of stillness that is itself a presence. Colton Reese glanced toward the back of the diner. He took in the leather and the road-worn faces and made the calculation that certain kinds of men make when they encounter something they didn't expect. He filed it away as irrelevant and returned his attention to Ruth. The zoning reclassification that the county approved last month creates some challenges for businesses in this area, he said, in the smooth, modulated tone of a man who has delivered this particular speech before. Challenges that Vale Development is positioned to help with. What zoning reclassification? Audrey said. Everyone looked at her. She was standing at the service counter with a coffee pot in her hand and the particular directness of a woman who has just heard something that connects to something else she was told 20 minutes ago. Colton looked at her the way he'd looked at the diner as a component rather than a person. This is a private business conversation, he said. This is a public diner, Audrey said, and I work here. What zoning reclassification? Colton returned to Ruth. Perhaps we could speak privately. I don't have private conversations about my business from my staff, Ruth said. What's your concern about zoning? Colton opened his briefcase. He had a briefcase, which was the kind of detail that would have seemed ordinary in a law office and felt slightly theatrical in a Route 66 diner, and produced a document. He placed it on the counter in front of Ruth. The county's commercial corridor review reclassified this stretch of Route 66 from C2 to C4 last month, he said. Under C4 designation, any structure below the updated commercial occupancy square footage requirements is subject to compliance review. This building, he glanced at his document, falls below that threshold. Ruth looked at the document. She was quiet for a moment. "When did this reclassification happen?" she said. "It was filed March 14th, Colton said. "The notice period concluded at the end of April." "I didn't receive a notice," Ruth said. "The county sends notices to property owners of record. As of March, the county's records show the property registered to." He checked his document, Mesa Ridge Properties, LLC. Ruth went very still. "That's not right," she said. "I've owned this building since 1983, outright, no mortgage, since 2001. "There may have been a clerical issue," Colton said, in the tone that people use when they believe the thing they're describing was not a clerical issue. "These county record discrepancies do happen. What it means practically is that the notice may not have reached you through official channels, which is why Vail Development wanted to reach out directly." He folded his hands on the briefcase. "The compliance review window is 60 days. After that, structures that don't meet the C4 requirements become subject to forced assessment." "Forced assessment," Ruth repeated. "The county can compel a sale at assessed value," he said, "which, under current commercial land valuations in this corridor, would be significantly below market." The kitchen had gone quiet. Hector was standing in the pass-through window, wiping his hands on a towel, listening. "So," Ruth said slowly, "a zoning change was filed in March that I didn't receive notice of because the county's records show I don't own my own building. And now you're here in June, 2 weeks before the compliance window closes, to let me know that if I don't sell to Vail Development, the county will force me to sell at below market value." Colton smiled with his professional face. "I wouldn't characterize it quite that way." "How would you characterize it?" "As an opportunity for a mutually beneficial, Mr. Reese." It was Wade. He had not raised his voice, and yet it crossed the entire length of the diner with complete clarity. Everyone looked at him. He was still seated, still holding his coffee cup, and his expression had not changed from the calm, considered look it had worn all morning. "How long have you had this document?" Colton turned. He looked at Wade the way he'd looked at the biker table before, as irrelevant, but this time the look didn't hold. There was something in Wade's expression that made the irrelevance calculation feel unstable. "I'm sorry," Colton said. "The compliance document," Wade said. "How long have you had it?" "That's not because it's dated March 15th, Wade said, "which means you've had it for 3 months. And you're here with 12 days left in the compliance window." He set down his coffee cup. "You waited 3 months. That's not an oversight. That's a strategy." The diner was silent enough to hear the ceiling fan. Colton's composure did not break. Men like Colton had composures that were built for rooms exactly like this one. "I'm not sure who you are," he said. "But this is a private business, I told you," Audrey said from the counter. "This is a public diner." Her voice was steady. Something in her had changed since Colton walked in, had sharpened, had found the anger she'd been carefully managing all morning and turned it into something colder and more useful than anger. Then the front door opened for the 3rd time that morning. And the woman who walked in was someone Audrey recognized not from the diner, but from a photograph in the Red Mesa Gazette that had run 3 months ago, the one about a journalist doing a long-form feature on small businesses along the Route 66 corridor. Her name was Nora Bell. She was 36 years old, wore her dark hair short, and carried a worn canvas bag that contained, among other things, a digital recorder, 3 notebooks, and the particular tenacious intelligence of someone who had been a working journalist for 12 years and had learned that the best stories walked through doors you didn't know were open. She had come to the Desert Rose Diner this morning for the charity ride story. She had a camera and a notebook, and she had planned to speak to the Hells Angels about their veterans fundraiser. She had not planned to walk into what she was walking into. But Nora Bell was the kind of journalist who knew what a story looked like, and what she was looking at right now was a story. She stopped just inside the door. She looked at Colton Reese with his briefcase. She looked at the document on Ruth's counter. She looked at Wade in the back and at the 17 bikers who were very carefully not moving and at Audrey standing at the service counter with a coffee pot and the expression of a woman who's the still place inside a storm. Then she pulled her recorder out of her bag and turned it on. "Nora Bell," she said to the room in general. "Red Mesa Gazette. I'm here to cover the Veterans Charity Ride." She looked at Colton. "I'm going to stay, if that's all right." Colton looked at the recorder. Something in his composure shifted, not breaking, but bending. "This is a private public diner," said Audrey. Hector and Wade in overlapping unison. Nora almost smiled. She found a stool at the counter, sat down, and opened her notebook. Colton's second man, the one who had said nothing since they walked in, leaned toward Colton and said something quiet. Colton's jaw tightened. He picked up his document from Ruth's counter. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, and his voice had acquired the clipped quality of controlled frustration. "I'm going to leave you with this. I'd strongly advise you to retain legal counsel and review your options within the next." "I'm going to need a copy of that," Nora said. From the counter. "This is a private document. It's a county filing," Nora said. "It's public record. I can get it from the county courthouse, but it'll save me 40 minutes if you just hand it over." The two men looked at each other. Ruth reached across the counter and picked up the document before either of them could. She looked at it for a moment. Then she handed it to Nora. "Colton," said Mrs. Mercer. "You left it on my counter," Ruth said. "It's mine." Colton clicked his briefcase shut. He looked at the room, at Nora with her recorder, at Wade with his coffee, at Audrey with her coffee pot, 17 bikers who were watching him with the calm patience of men who had nothing better to do than be present for exactly as long as they needed to be, and he made the calculation that certain kinds of men make when the room has stopped cooperating. "We'll be in touch," he said. He and his companion walked out. The room held for a moment. Then Hector put down his towel and said, "From the pass-through window, Ruth. You should call your lawyer." "I know," Ruth said. She was looking at the door. Nora was already reading the document. Her pen was moving. Audrey set the coffee pot down on the counter and said, quietly, "The county records show someone else owns the building." "Mesa Ridge Properties," Ruth said. "I've never heard that name in my life." "I have," said a voice from the back. Everyone looked at Wade. He had his phone in his hand. He set it down on the table, with the screen facing up, and slid it slightly toward the center of the table so Cole, beside him, could read it. "Mesa Ridge Properties LLC was incorporated in February," Wade said. "Registered agent is a law firm out of Phoenix. The firm's client list includes—" He glanced at the phone, Vale Development. The silence that followed was the kind that arrives when a suspicion becomes a fact. Ruth looked at the door again. Then she looked at Wade. "How did you—" "Friend of mine does title research," Wade said simply. "I texted him when the kid mentioned zoning earlier." He looked at Audrey. "You asked the right questions." Nora's pen was moving faster. "This is deliberate," Audrey said. She wasn't asking. "They filed a false ownership record with the county to intercept the zoning notice. So Ruth would never know the reclassification was happening. So the compliance window would run out and the county would be forced to sell at assessed value," Nora said, without looking up, "which is probably about 40 cents on the dollar in the current market." She looked up. "How many other buildings on this block?" Wade said. 6. All small businesses. 3 of them have been in their current ownership for over 20 years. And if all 6 properties go through forced assessment, the Vale Development project becomes viable," Wade said. "The land assembly for whatever they're planning, hotel, resort, corridor, doesn't matter, suddenly has a cost basis that makes the numbers work." He looked at Ruth. "This is not an accident." Ruth sat down on the stool behind her counter for the first time in Audrey's memory. Not from weakness, from the particular weight of someone absorbing the full dimension of something they had almost missed. She put both hands flat on the counter and looked at them. 41 years, she said. "It won't happen," Audrey said. It came out with a certainty that surprised her. She looked at Wade. "Right?" Wade looked at her for a moment. "Not if we move fast," he said. He picked up his phone again. "Nora, what's your timeline for the Gazette story?" "Print runs Thursday," Nora said. "But the online version can go up same day if I have enough to substantiate." "How much do you need?" the LLC registration, the county filing, and ideally one more connection between Reese and the false ownership record. She looked at the document in her hands. And I need to know why Preston Vale was here this morning. The room went quiet again. Audrey looked at the front window. Preston's car was gone. His friends were gone. He came in after a night of partying, she said slowly. With friends. The way he talked about the building, it wasn't offhand. He knew which booth to ask for. He said, "Your father may own this block soon," like it was a fact, not a possibility. She looked at Wade. He came here because he already knew about the acquisition plan. He came here, Wade said carefully, to establish presence, to make sure the employees knew that a change was coming and that the Vale name was already in the room. He looked at Nora. The humiliation wasn't incidental. It was the point. "If you break the workers' confidence early," Nora said, thinking aloud, writing, "the resistance is softer when the acquisition formally happens." "That's not a real estate strategy," Cole said, from down the table. "That's intimidation." "Those aren't always different things," Wade said. Audrey felt it all settle into place with the specific weight of something that had been true all morning and had only now been named. The contempt, the filming, the comments about the block, about her job, about Ruth's future. It wasn't drunken arrogance from a spoiled kid who got out of hand. It was calculated. Not by Preston. Preston was the instrument, not the architect. But it was calculated by the system that had formed him and sent him here, and he had played his part with the enthusiasm of someone who believed that the ugliness was a feature rather than a cost. She picked up her coffee pot. "Can I get anyone a refill?" she said. It was such a Audrey Collins thing to say so perfectly, precisely her, that two of the bikers at the back table actually laughed. Not at her. At the sheer human stubborn normalcy of a woman who has just had the ground shifted under her feet and responds by doing her job. Wade laughed too. It was a warm sound, and it broke the tension in the room like a window being opened. "Yeah," he said. "I'll take one." She walked to the back table and poured his coffee. He watched her do it with the measured attention of a man who has learned to read people quickly and is still discovering things about this one. "You're not scared," he said quietly, while she poured. "I'm terrified," she said, equally quiet. "But Mason needs me at work on Monday, which means I need this job on Monday, which means whatever is happening with this building has to be stopped before Monday." She looked at him. "Is that possible?" Wade wrapped both hands around his cup. "We can make it very difficult for them to proceed quietly," he said, "which is the only way this works for them quietly. They need this to happen before anyone's paying attention." He glanced toward Nora, who was on her phone now, talking quickly with the focused economy of a journalist working a deadline. "Nora's paying attention," he said. "So are you," Audrey said. "So are you," he replied. "You're the one who asked the right questions." She moved on to refill the next cup. Wade watched her go and thought about what it cost a person, specifically this person, specifically a woman carrying her brother's medical bills and a double shift and 41 years of someone else's legacy, all on the same set of shoulders, to still be standing straight and filling coffee cups with a steady hand an hour after. Someone tried to break her in front of a room full of people. He thought about Preston Vale in the parking lot, rehearsing his apology. He thought about Colton Reese with his briefcase and his county documents and his timed strategy. He thought about Graham Vale, who was presumably in an office somewhere, reviewing projections, unaware that his son had walked into a diner this morning and set something in motion that was going to travel all the way back to his desk. The front door opened. Preston Vale came through it for the second time. This time he was alone, and he was moving differently, not with the loose arrogance of the morning's first entrance, but with contained urgency of someone who has just received a phone call and is trying to figure out what it means. He stopped when he saw Nora with her recorder and notebook. He stopped when he saw that the Hells Angels were still there. He stopped when he saw, on Nora's lap, the county document that Colton Reese had brought and Ruth had taken. And Wade watched his face in the moment that Preston Vale understood that the room he'd tried to walk out of this morning and reset had not reset at all, that while he'd been in the parking lot rehearsing an apology, The story had kept moving without him. "We need to talk," Preston said to no one in particular, because he wasn't sure who was in charge of the room anymore. And that uncertainty was something he'd never felt before in his life. "We do," Wade said from the back. He nodded at the stool across from Nora. "Sit down." Preston looked at the stool. He looked at Nora. He looked at Audrey, who had stopped in the middle of the diner with a coffee pot and was watching him with the patient, level attention of a woman who has spent the morning being underestimated and is no longer inclined to let that slide. He sat down. Outside through the front window of the Desert Rose Diner, Route 66 stretched in both directions east into the morning heat, west toward whatever the rest of the day was preparing to deliver, and the sun was fully up now, burning off the last of the cool, and everything that had been in shadow when the morning started was out in the open now, blinking in the unsparing light. Preston sat on that counter stool like a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was thinner than he thought. He kept his hands flat on the formica, the same formica his coffee had stained 2 hours earlier, now clean because Audrey had wiped it, and he looked at Nora Bell's recorder with the expression of someone who has never in his life had to think carefully before speaking and was discovering, at 24 years old, that the skill did not come naturally. Nora didn't rush him. She was the kind of journalist who understood that silence was a tool, that people filled silence with truth far more often than they filled questions with it, and she sat with her pen resting on her notebook and let the quiet do its work. Wade watched from the back. He had not moved from his seat. He had not needed to. "How did you know about the zoning filing?" Preston finally said. He was looking at Wade. "Your father's regional director told us," Wade said. "Indirectly. The way people tell you things when they're trying to control a conversation and overestimate how much they're controlling it. Colton came here about 40 minutes ago. Brought documents. Made a presentation." Wade tilted his head slightly. "You didn't know he was coming." It wasn't a question. And the way Preston's face moved, a quick, involuntary tightening around the eyes, confirmed it. "No," Preston said, "I didn't. Nora wrote something." "But you knew about the acquisition," Audrey said. She had set the coffee pot down and was standing near the end of the counter, arms at her sides, voice level. "You knew this morning, when you came in." Preston looked at her. The arrogance that had been his default expression for the first half of the morning was gone now, not replaced by humility exactly, but by something rawer and less practiced. He looked younger without it. He looked like what he actually was, a 24-year-old who had spent his entire life inside a system that protected him from consequences and was now sitting inside the consequences with no protection in sight. "My father's been working on the Route 66 corridor project for 2 years, Preston said. "The diner is part of the land assembly. I knew that." He looked at the table. "I came here this morning because we'd been driving around and someone suggested stopping here, and he stopped." "You wanted to see it," Audrey said quietly. "The place your father was going to acquire. That's not—" He stopped again. "Preston." Wade's voice was low, but it reached every corner of the room. "Don't spend your energy on the version that makes you look better. You don't have that kind of time right now." Something passed across Preston's face, resistance. Then something that looked like it might, eventually, become honesty. "I wanted to see it," he said. "Yes. And when we got here, and the waitress wouldn't give me the table I wanted." He looked at Audrey and then quickly away. "I don't know. Something just I felt like I could do whatever I wanted here." "Because it was already ours," Audrey said. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The diner was so quiet that the sound of Hector washing dishes in the kitchen was clearly audible through the pass-through. Ruth was still seated on her stool behind the counter, but she was watching Preston with an expression that had moved past anger into something more complicated, the look of a woman, and trying to understand the shape of the thing that had been aimed at her without her knowing. "The ownership record," Ruth said. "Mesa Ridge Properties." "Was that Colton?" Preston looked at her. "I don't know anything about a false ownership record, but you're not surprised," Nora said. The pause that followed was 2 seconds long. In a court of law, 2 seconds is nothing. In a diner full of people watching your face, 2 seconds is a confession. Colton runs the acquisitions division, Preston said carefully. The way he structures things, I don't always know the details. But you know his methods, Wade said. Preston put both hands over his face for a moment. Just a moment. Then he dropped them and looked at the recorder on the counter. Is that running? He said. Can you turn it off? No, Nora said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Audrey. And there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before, not performance, not calculation, just the unfiltered look of a person standing at a decision point and genuinely not knowing which direction to go. Before he could speak, the front door opened. The black SUV had been visible through the window for the past 90 seconds. Audrey had clocked it without saying anything. A vehicle, that expensive moving that slowly down a Route 66 block, was not sightseeing. It was assessing. She had watched it complete one full pass and park. And she had watched a man get out of the driver's side and say something into his phone. And she had thought, this is him. Graham Vale was 56 years old, and he carried himself with the specific weight of a man who had built something real from a hard start and never quite forgiven the world for making it as difficult as it was. He was taller than Preston, broader through the shoulders, with dark hair gone steel at the temples, and a face that had the earned severity of someone who made significant decisions as a matter of routine. He wore a jacket that didn't need to announce itself because everything else about him already had. He stopped inside the door. He took in the room the way experienced men take in rooms quickly, thoroughly, with the practiced assessment of someone who has walked into difficult situations before and survived them by reading the temperature accurately before speaking. He saw Nora's recorder. He saw the county document on the counter. He saw his son on the stool with his hands flat on the formica and his shoulders carrying the particular shape of someone who has already lost something but hasn't yet been told what it is. He saw Audrey. He saw the Hells Angels in the back of the diner, 17 of them, still patient, present, and he took a moment longer on that than he'd taken on anything else. Then he walked to the counter and stood beside his son. Preston, he said. His voice was controlled. Years of controlled. Dad. Preston looked up at him with an expression that was half relief and half something that looked like bracing for impact. Graham looked at Audrey. You're the waitress, he said. It was not unkind. It was simply direct. My name is Audrey Collins, she said. I've worked here for 6 years. Graham nodded once. He looked at Nora. And you are? Nora Bell. Red Mesa Gazette. His jaw moved slightly. He looked at the recorder. He looked at the document on the counter. All right, he said, with the quiet of a man doing very fast arithmetic. He pulled out his wallet. Audrey knew what was coming before his hand was fully out of his jacket. She had seen it coming from the moment his SUV parked, the instinct of a man who has solved problems with resources for so long that resources have become his first language. He placed a check on the counter. He had written it in the car. The amount was significant. She could see enough of the figure to understand that it was the kind of number that was meant to end conversations before they became stories. For the inconvenience my son caused this morning, Graham said, and for any distress, I'd like to handle this privately and directly. Audrey looked at the check. She did not pick it up, Mr. Vale, she said. I appreciate that you came yourself. I know you didn't have to do that. She looked at the check. But I'm not going to take your money. Graham's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. It's a fair amount. I'm sure it is, Audrey said. That's not the problem. She looked at him steadily. The problem is that your son came into this diner this morning and treated me like I was something beneath him. He filmed me cleaning the floor. He told this room that his family was going to take this building and that everyone who works here should start looking for another job. He did that because he thought your name made him untouchable. She let that sit for a moment. Writing a check tells him he was right. Graham was quiet. In the back of the diner, not one of the 17 bikers moved. Wade had his coffee in both hands and his eyes on Graham Vale's face, reading it the way he read everything for what was real beneath what was presented. What would you like instead? Graham said. He was asking seriously. That was the thing Audrey hadn't expected that he would ask seriously. I want him to understand why it was wrong, she said. Not what it cost you to fix it, why it was wrong. Graham looked at his son. Preston was looking at Audrey with an expression that was genuinely difficult to interpret, not because it was empty, but because it was full of too many things at once. Shame and resistance, and something that was trying very hard not to be recognized as fear. Show him, Wade said from the back. Graham turned. He looked at Wade with the careful attention of a man encountering someone he has not yet categorized. I'm sorry, Graham said. Show your son the footage, Wade said. Before you decide what to do next, you should see what actually happened this morning. I know what happened, Graham said. Preston told me with respect, Wade said. Your son told you the version that had him in it. I'm asking you to watch the version that has your son in it. He looked at Cole at the end of the table. Cole. Cole held up his phone. On it was 47 minutes of continuous footage. Not edited, not narrated. Just the diner from the angle of a back booth, the snapping fingers, the deliberate spill, the money pushed into the mess, the command to clean it up, the phone in Audrey's face while she knelt on the floor, and Preston's announcement to the room about the acquisition and what it meant for the people who worked there. Graham Vale watched 4 minutes of it. He watched it with his phone in both hands and his son sitting 18 inches to his left. And his face went through things that faces go through when a man sees something that reorganizes what he thought he knew. He put the phone down on the counter. He did not look at Preston immediately. He looked at the counter, at the clean formica, at the rings left by coffee cups, at the ordinary surface of an ordinary diner that had been standing on this street since before his company existed, and he was quiet for long enough that the silence became its own kind of statement. Then he looked at his son. Preston, he said, I don't. The word was quiet, but it had the density of something load-bearing. Don't explain it. Don't contextualize it. I watched it. Preston closed his mouth. Graham picked up the check from the counter and put it back in his jacket. Then he turned to Audrey. I owe you an apology on behalf of my son. Not a transaction, an apology. I'm sorry this happened to you in your place of work. You deserved none of it. He looked at Ruth, who had been watching from her stool with the patience of a woman who has been in this business long enough to have seen many kinds of difficult men and has learned to wait for the real one to emerge. And I'm sorry for any alarm Colton's visit caused this morning. Alarm, Ruth said carefully, is one word for it. Graham looked at the county document on the counter. He picked it up. He read it. And Audrey watched his face as he read it, the way a fast reader's eyes move, and the way a person's expression changes when they're encountering something unexpected versus something they already knew. He had not known. She could see it. Not the specific details, not Mesa Ridge Properties, LLC. Not the intercepted notice. Not the deliberate timing of the compliance window. He had known about the acquisition. He had known about the zoning corridor strategy in broad terms. But Colton Reese had taken those broad terms and built something specific and ugly inside them, something that Graham Vale had not authorized, and perhaps would not have authorized if it had been put to him directly. Where is Colton? Graham said. His voice had changed. It was quieter, which made it colder. He left about an hour ago, Nora said. After Mrs. Mercer took the document he'd left on her counter. Graham looked at Nora, then at the recorder. Is this all on the record? Yes, Nora said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, good. He looked at his phone. Excuse me for a moment. He walked to the far end of the counter, put his phone to his ear, and spoke for 90 seconds in a voice too low to carry. When he came back, his face had the set expression of a man who has made a decision and closed the door on reconsidering it. Colton Reese is no longer employed by Vale Development, he said to the room. The silence that followed was the kind that arrives when a significant thing happens so quickly that the room needs a moment to confirm it actually happened. Just like that, Cole said from the back table. He used company resources to file a fraudulent county record, Graham said. That's not a disciplinary conversation. That's a termination and potentially a criminal referral. He looked at Nora. You can print that. Nora was writing fast. The acquisition, Ruth said. This block. Graham looked at her. The acquisition is on hold, he said. Effective now. Ruth absorbed this. On hold isn't the same as canceled. No, Graham agreed. It isn't. He sat down on the stool next to his son, both of them now on the same side of the counter, facing Audrey and Ruth, which was not lost on anyone in the room. I'm going to be honest with you. I came here to manage a situation. I thought my son had embarrassed himself with a service worker, and I needed to settle it quietly. He looked at the document. That's not what this is. No, Audrey said. What this is, Graham said slowly, is my company's acquisition strategy being used by one of my directors to do something I didn't know about and wouldn't have approved. He looked at Wade. How many other buildings on this block? 6, Wade said. Same ownership pattern on all of them. Graham closed his eyes for a moment. How long have you known this? About 2 hours, Wade said. Your son mentioned zoning this morning when he was apologizing to Audrey. My title researcher friend is fast. Graham looked at Audrey. He apologized? He tried to, Audrey said. He minimized it, but he tried. Something in Graham's expression changed, not softened exactly, but acquired a different texture. The look of a father who is learning something about his son from someone who has no reason to be generous with the information. Then the door opened again. Colton Reese came through it with the energy of a man who has received a phone call he didn't expect and has decided that the best response to unexpected bad news is to arrive in person and take control of the narrative before it takes control of him. He had his briefcase. He had his professional composure. He had walked 2 blocks from wherever he'd parked, and his composure had done its maintenance work all the way here. It lasted exactly as long as it took him to see Graham Vale sitting at the counter. Graham, he said. He stopped. He recalibrated. I was going to call you. This situation is more complex than... You're terminated, Graham said. He didn't turn around. He said it to the counter, the way you say something when you've already said it and don't see the value in emotion. Colton's composure cracked down the center. Graham, I think we need to talk privately. We're past private, Graham said. He turned then and looked at Colton directly. You used company structure to file fraudulent county records. You intercepted property notices. You ran a compliance window strategy without my authorization. That is not an aggressive acquisition technique. That is fraud. I was serving the project's interests. You were serving your bonus metrics, Graham said. And you did it in a way that exposed this company to criminal liability and put an elderly business owner at risk of losing her property through manufactured legal pressure. He stood up from the stool. He was taller than Colton by an inch, and the inch mattered now. Leave the briefcase. Colton stared at him. Graham, the briefcase contains company documents. Leave it. Colton set the briefcase on the nearest table. His hands weren't entirely steady. He looked around the diner at Nora with her recorder and her fast pen, at the bikers in the back who were watching him with the impassive attention of people who have seen a man lose something and are neither sorry nor glad about it, just present for it. He looked at Audrey. And in that moment, the moment before he left, the moment when he'd lost everything he'd come to preserve, he did what certain kinds of men do, when the room has finally stopped cooperating with their version of events. He looked at the person with the least institutional power in the room, and he aimed what was left of his authority at her. You, he said. You're the one who turned a minor customer service complaint into Mr. Reese, Wade's voice low, definitive. Colton stopped. The recorder is still running, Wade said. And there are 17 witnesses in this room, 2 of whom are former law enforcement and 3 of whom are documented on camera footage that already exists online. He looked at Colton with the uncomplicated clarity of a man who has nothing to prove and no patience for those who do. Whatever you're about to say to that woman, I'd think very hard about whether you want it to be the last thing you're remembered for saying. Colton closed his mouth. He walked out without another word. The door swung shut. The room breathed. Then a sound came from the pass-through window that Audrey had been listening for and dreading, and hoping for all at the same time, the sound of a truck door. Her brother's truck. The specific rattle of the left panel that Mason had been meaning to fix for 2 years and kept saying he'd get to when his wrist was better. Mason Collins came through the front door of the Desert Rose Diner at 22 minutes past 11, moving with the careful gait of a man whose hip still required his full attention on stairs, but who refused to let that fact become anyone else's concern. He was big-framed, broad-shouldered, with Audrey's same blonde coloring and the patient, observant face of someone who had spent 18 years in mechanical work, which is work that teaches you to see systems and understand how things fail. He had gotten Audrey's text at 10:52. He had been at his physical therapy appointment. He had left early. He stopped inside the door and read the room the way a mechanic reads an engine, not the individual parts, but the relationship between them, the way each component was affecting the others. He saw his sister at the counter, standing straight. He saw Ruth on her stool. He saw Graham Vale, who he didn't recognize. He saw the bikers in the back, and his face registered recognition not of specific faces, but of the type, the affiliation, the meaning of the vests. And he nodded once toward the back table with the quiet respect of a veteran acknowledging a community that had shown up for veterans. Wade nodded back. Then Mason's eyes moved to Graham Vale's face, and something happened in his expression that Audrey caught and that made her go very still. "Mason," she said, "this is Graham Vale. His son was the customer this morning." "I know who Graham Vale is," Mason said. His voice was entirely even. He was looking at Graham with the particular look of someone who has stored something for a long time and is now deciding what to do with it. "His company owns the warehouse where I worked. Sunrise Distribution. Vale Development subsidiary." Graham went very still. The room went with him. "Your warehouse," Mason said. He walked to the counter and stood next to his sister. He was not raising his voice. He was not threatening. He was simply a man who had been waiting for an opportunity to say true things to the right person, and the opportunity had arrived. "I worked there for 7 years. I filed 3 separate safety reports on the North Loading Bay support structures. March 2021, November to 2021, and 2022. All 3 were logged as received by facility management. None of them were escalated for repair authorization." He looked at Graham. "The beam failed in April 2022. I fell 12 feet. I've had 4 surgeries. My sister has been working double shifts for 2 years to cover what my disability payments don't." The silence was absolute. Graham Vale looked at Mason Collins with the expression of a man who has just had a wall removed from a room he thought he knew the dimensions of. "I didn't know," Graham said. "I know you didn't know," Mason said. "That's actually the problem." His voice was still even, still patient, with the specific patience of someone who has been angry for 2 years and has metabolized it into something colder and more sustainable. "The people who should have told you didn't tell you. And the people who should have acted on my reports didn't act. And nobody in your company was ever asked to answer for that." He looked at Graham. 3 reports, 12 feet, 4 surgeries, 2 years of my sister's double shifts. He was quiet for a moment. "Your company did that, not on purpose. But the way a machine fails not because anyone wanted it to fail, but because nobody was paying attention to the parts that were wearing out." Graham put his hand on the counter. It was a steadying motion, the gesture of a man absorbing weight. "The safety reports," he said. "Do you have copies?" "I have everything," Mason said. "I've had everything for 2 years. I've been waiting for someone worth showing it to." Nora's pen had not stopped moving. Wade set down his coffee cup for the first time in an hour. Preston Vale was looking at his father. He had been looking at him since Mason started talking, and his face had the expression of a person watching something they didn't know existed being excavated from the ground, not guilty. Exactly, because he hadn't known either, but implicated in the way that everyone who lives inside a system is implicated by what the system does when no one who benefits from it is paying attention. Graham turned to his son, and what he said was quiet, and it was not for the room, but the room heard it anyway, because the room had earned it. "I spent 20 years building something," Graham said. "And the whole time, I told myself that the people I hired would do things the right way, because I did things the right way. I told myself that my name was enough to guarantee the standard." He looked at his hands. I told you the same thing. I told you that our name opened doors, that our name meant something. He looked at Preston. I told you that so many times that you started to believe the name was the thing, that having it meant you'd already done the work. His voice was steady, but the steadiness cost him something. I made you this way, not alone. But I had the largest share of it. Preston said nothing. I'm going to fix this, Graham said. Not to the room. To his son. All of it. The warehouse, the zoning scheme, Ruth's building, Mason's case, all of it. He looked at his son. And you are going to be part of fixing it. Not because it'll look good. Because you owe these people something that cannot be paid in money, and the only currency that actually works is time and work and showing up. He held Preston's gaze. Do you understand me? Preston was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, yes. It was one word. But it was the first word he had said all morning that was entirely true. Audrey looked at Wade. Wade was watching Graham and Preston with the expression of a man who has seen many things in 53 years and knows the difference between a performance of accountability and the real thing. He was not entirely certain which this was, but he was not entirely certain it wasn't. Mr. Vale, he said. Graham looked up. Intentions are the beginning, Wade said, not the end. He reached into his jacket and produced a card plain. No logo, just a name and a number. He set it on the counter. When you're ready to talk about what fixing actually looks like, call that number. It belongs to a lawyer who works with workers' injury cases and has been waiting for someone to bring her the Sunrise distribution file for 2 years. He looked at Graham steadily. She's very good. She's also very thorough. I'd recommend calling her before she calls you. Graham picked up the card. He looked at it. He put it in his pocket. Who are you? He said to Wade. Wade Callahan, Wade said. Road Captain, Hells Angels, Red Mesa. We came in this morning for breakfast, after a charity ride for injured veterans. He picked up his coffee cup. We're still here. Graham looked at him for a moment. Then something happened on his face that was unexpected, not quite a smile, but the shape that a face makes when it recognizes something worth recognizing. I'm glad you were, Graham said. Nora closed her notebook. She had enough. She had more than enough. She had the story that had been waiting inside this morning since the moment Preston Vale snapped his fingers at a woman named Audrey Collins and believed that was the kind of man he was. Audrey looked at the diner around her, at Ruth on her stool, at Mason beside her, at Wade in the back with his coffee, at Graham Vale holding a card with a lawyer's number on it, at his son sitting with his hands flat on the formica, and something on his face that she didn't have a word for yet, but thought might eventually become the beginning of something different. She picked up her coffee pot. She went back to work, because the floor still needed walking, and the cups still needed filling, and the Desert Rose Diner was still open, and as long as it was open, Audrey Collins was going to do her job with the same steady, unbreakable dignity that had carried her through every hard morning she'd ever worked. The hardest of which, she thought, was probably not this one. But this one was the one that was going to change things. She could feel it. The way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, not in the air, but in the quality of the quiet, in the way everything that had been moving fast had suddenly gone still and clear, the way things go still and clear in the moment before something shifts. Everything was about to shift. The agreement was not written in a contract. It was spoken in a diner on a Tuesday morning in June, with a journalist recorder running and 17 bikers as witnesses. And in Red Mesa, Arizona, that was sufficient. Audrey had one condition. She stated it plainly, without preamble. While Graham Vale was still standing at the counter with Wade's lawyer card in his pocket and the weight of Mason's 3 safety reports settling into the architecture of everything he thought he'd built. Your son works, she said, not a donation, not a foundation gift with his name on it. He works, here, at the diner, doing what I do, and at the Hells Angels volunteer garage, doing what those men do for 12 weeks. Ordinary wages, ordinary hours, ordinary rules, no special treatment, no early exits, no calling his father when it gets hard. She looked at Preston, and it will get hard. Preston was looking at her with the expression of someone who has not yet decided whether the thing in front of him is punishment or something else entirely. Graham looked at his son. He did not ask if Preston was willing. He said, "He'll be here Monday." "I'll decide that," Preston said. Everyone in the room looked at him. It wasn't defiance, it was something closer to the last reflex of a man who has spent his entire life having his decisions preempted and is reaching for the one thing that still belongs to him, the act of choosing. Wade recognized it. He'd seen it before in young men who'd had everything done for them for so long that the muscle of personal decision had atrophied from disuse, and who didn't know how to exercise it except by pushing back. "Then decide," Wade said from the back. His voice was not unkind. "Nobody's going to do it for you." Preston looked at Audrey. At the counter, she'd wiped clean. At the apron she'd been wearing since 5:30 in the morning. At the way she was standing, not performing patience, just actually patient, in the way that comes from years of doing the same hard thing and finding that the hard thing does not diminish you if you carry it right. "Monday," Preston said. "I'll be here Monday." The first Monday arrived with the unforgiving punctuality of all things Preston Vale had previously been able to ignore. He showed up at 5:45 in the morning because Audrey had told him the shift started at 5:30, and he had, in a calculation he didn't fully examine, decided that arriving 15 minutes late was a reasonable assertion of selfhood. Hector was already at the grill. Ruth was doing the cash drawer. Audrey was tying her apron. She looked at him when he walked in. She looked at the clock on the wall. She said nothing. That said everything. "I know," he said. "Apron's behind the counter," she said. "Dishes need to come out of the sanitizer. After that, I need the table set before 6. He found the apron. It was a plain white one, the kind that absorbed whatever the morning threw at it and required washing every night, and he tied it with the immediate practical difficulty of someone who has never in his life needed to tie an apron because food had always arrived to him, never from him. His first knot came loose. He retied it. He went and got the dishes out of the sanitizer. The sanitizer was hot. He didn't know that until his hands were in it. He pulled them back fast and stood there for a second with his hands in the air. And Hector, from the grill, said without turning around, "Use the rack handle." The metal one on the side. Preston used the rack handle. He got the dishes out. He set the tables. He got 2 orders wrong in the first hour. He dropped a full glass of orange juice on a table that Audrey had just cleaned. He forgot to bring a customer's toast, and the customer had finished his eggs before he remembered, and the customer, a man in his 60s, with a contractor's hands and a time-limited morning, said, without cruelty but without softness either, "Son, the toast was on the ticket." "I'm sorry," Preston said. "I'll get it now." "I don't need it now," the man said. "I needed it 20 minutes ago." He put down his fork and looked at Preston with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of a man who deals in materials and schedules and has no patience for theoretical apologies. "What's your name?" "Preston." "Preston, I've been eating breakfast here for 9 years. Audrey has never once forgotten my toast." He picked up his coffee. "Think about why that is." Preston thought about it while he cleared the table. He thought about it because the man hadn't said it meanly, hadn't said to embarrass him the way Preston had embarrassed Audrey 3 weeks earlier with the room watching. He'd said it the way someone says something when they believe the person hearing it is capable of doing better, which was a form of respect Preston hadn't experienced from a stranger before and didn't know what to do with. He brought the next table's toast before they asked for it. Audrey noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. The second week was harder than the first in ways Preston hadn't anticipated. The physical difficulty, he'd expected the aching feet, the weight of the trays, the relentlessness of the pace during the breakfast rush. What he hadn't expected was the social difficulty. The customers recognized him. Not all of them, and not immediately. But Nora's story had run in the Gazette on Thursday of the previous week, and the video that Cole had recorded, the complete, unedited 47 minutes, had been shared widely enough that the clip of Preston dropping money into the coffee puddle and ordering Audrey to clean it up had found its way to the kind of places on the internet where these things travel. People came into the diner who would not otherwise have come in. Some of them came because they wanted to see Ruth's place and support it. Some of them came because they wanted to see Preston Vale wearing an apron and bussing tables, which was a kind of witnessing that satisfied something in them. On the Wednesday of the second week, a young woman sitting at a two-top recognized him from across the room. She took out her phone and pointed it at him. Preston was carrying a tray of dirty dishes to the back. He saw the phone. He felt the same thing he'd felt when he'd pointed his own phone at Audrey, the power dynamic of the lens. The reduction of a person to content. The way a camera strips the subject of their right to just doing the thing they're doing without being made into a thing for someone else's use. He understood it in his body before he understood it in his mind. He kept walking. He took the dishes to the back. He came out and refilled the woman's coffee and said, "Can I get you anything else?" with the professional neutrality that Audrey had modeled for him every morning for 2 weeks. The woman lowered her phone. She looked at him not with contempt, but with the assessing curiosity of someone who expected one thing and is encountering another. "You're really doing this," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He thought about the answer for a moment. "Because I should have been doing something like it a long time ago," he said. He moved to the next table. At the volunteer garage, things were different in ways that were harder to navigate. The Hells Angels volunteer garage operated out of a space 4 blocks from the diner, a working shop where motorcycles and vehicles were repaired for veterans, seniors, and low-income workers who couldn't afford commercial rates. Wade had been running it for 11 years. There were 6 core volunteers, all bikers, all with trade skills, and they operated with the organized efficiency of people who have found the thing they're good at and have decided to do it for the people who need it most. Preston arrived his first Saturday at 8 in the morning. Wade put him on cleaning duty immediately, not as a punishment, but as the standard entry point for every new volunteer, which Wade explained with the brevity of a man who doesn't need to justify his methods. "You learn a shop by cleaning it," Wade said. "You find out where everything is, what everything costs, what gets wasted, and what gets preserved. Clean the shop, you understand the shop. Understand the shop, you can work in it." Preston cleaned the shop. It took 4 hours, and he got it right on the second pass because the first pass was the pass where he learned what right looked like. Decker showed him how to change oil without making a mess of the drain pan. A quiet man named Ortega, who had 22 years as a diesel mechanic before his knees gave out, showed him how to sort and catalog donated parts so they could be found when needed. Cole, who had taken the video that morning at the diner and who had watched Preston with the careful skepticism of Malkeen, who has seen too many privileged people perform accountability and then quietly stop, taught him the shop's inventory system with the patient economy of someone who respects the work even when he's not sure about the person doing it. Preston was not good at it. He was slow, imprecise with tools, and made the particular errors of someone whose hands have never been asked to do this kind of work, reaching for the wrong wrench, over-tightening a fitting, forgetting to check the specification before assuming. But he showed up every Saturday, and he stayed the full day, and he did not complain, and gradually, the quality of his errors began to change from the errors of carelessness to the errors of someone learning. Mason was not at the garage the first 2 Saturdays. He came on the third. He walked in at 9 in the morning and went straight to his workstation, a corner of the garage, where, over the past 8 months, with the help of various volunteers, he had been slowly and painfully rebuilding a 1,969 Indian motorcycle that had been his father's, and that the accident had interrupted mid-restoration. His right hand was still not at full strength, and his hip required the high stool that Decker had sourced for him from a medical supply company, and he worked within those limitations with the precise adaptability of someone who has had to relearn the geography of his own capability. Preston saw him come in. He went back to sorting parts. Mason worked for an hour without acknowledging Preston's presence. Then he said, without looking up from the Indian's carburetor, "Hand me the number 3 flathead. On the pegboard, second row." Preston found it. He brought it over. He held it out. Mason took it without looking at him. You're placing your left hand wrong when you're pulling the oil filter, he said. You're going to strip the housing. Watch how Ortega does it. Preston went back to his station. He watched how Ortega did it. He came back 20 minutes later. Like that. Mason looked at his hands. Better, he said. Still a little high on the grip. Drop it down. Let the heel of your palm carry the rotation. Preston adjusted. Like that? Mason went back to the carburetor. Yeah, he said. Like that. It was the longest conversation they had in the first 3 weeks. But Mason kept talking to him small, specific, technical exchanges about the work, and Preston kept listening. And this listening was more than Mason had expected, and less than he was ready to give credit for, and that was all right. That was how it worked. You didn't offer credit before it was earned, but you watched for the earning. The 4th week brought the first serious test. It arrived in the form of a phone call. Preston was behind the counter at the diner on a Thursday morning, his 3rd week of Thursday shifts, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked it during a quiet moment. It was Marcus, one of the friends who'd been with him the morning of the incident. The text read, dude, come meet us. Cabo trip this weekend, leaving Friday. Your dad's lawyers got the civil thing dismissed. You're clear. Come on, Preston stared at the text. He stood behind the counter of the Desert Rose Diner, with coffee rings on his apron and aching feet and 4 weeks of learning what hard work actually felt like. And he read the words "you're clear" and felt the pull of them in the specific place where his old life still lived, the place that said, this has all been very educational, and now you can go back. He put his phone away. He picked up the coffee pot. He refilled table 6 without being asked. But the pull didn't disappear entirely. It sat in him for 2 more days, quiet and patient, reminding him of what he'd had and could return to. And on Saturday morning at the garage, he was short with Decker about something minor, and then caught him and apologized before Decker had to say anything. Decker accepted the apology with the unceremonious directness of a man who considers an apology a done thing once it's been offered sincerely. You good? He said. Somebody offered me an exit, Preston said. You take it? No. Decker went back to the engine he was rebuilding. Good, he said. Would have been a waste of 5 weeks. The real test arrived on the Friday of the 5th week, without warning, the way real tests always arrive. It was a busy morning. The diner had picked up additional traffic, since Nora's story ran people from nearby towns who came specifically to support Ruth, regulars who came more often than they used to. A general influx of goodwill that Ruth received with the same practical grace she received everything. It was 11:15, the tail end of the breakfast rush bleeding into early lunch, and Preston was managing 3 tables simultaneously while Audrey handled the counter and 2 booths. A man came in, 40, business casual, carrying himself with the particular assurance of someone who has been told frequently that his time is valuable and has come to believe it absolutely. He sat at a table Preston was covering. He placed his order with the clipped efficiency of someone who considers a restaurant transaction a minor obstacle between him and more important things. He was not rude, not yet, but he had the quality of a man who was going to become rude if anything did not proceed exactly as he expected. His food came out right. Preston checked back at the 4-minute mark, which he had learned from watching Audrey, and which he now did without thinking about it. The man looked at his plate. This isn't what I ordered. Preston looked at the plate. It was exactly what he'd ordered. He had the ticket in his pocket. He checked it. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, side of fruit, Preston said. That's on the ticket. I said, over easy, the man said. I have scrambled on the ticket, Preston said. I can have them remade. I've been waiting 20 minutes. It was 11 minutes, Preston said. He had clocked it. The man stared at him. Excuse me? I put the order in at 11:04, Preston said. It's 11:15. That's 11 minutes. He kept his voice level. I'm happy to have the eggs remade the way you want them. It'll take about 4 minutes. The man's jaw set. He looked around the diner with the expression of someone assembling an audience. Is there a manager available? Because the service here is, I'll get Ruth, Preston said. He turned to go. No. The man's voice dropped half a register. He was looking at the table. Next to his a woman eating alone. mid-60s, local, who had been coming to the Desert Rose for as long as Preston had been working there, and who was now watching the exchange with the quiet attention of someone who has seen this movie before and knows how it ends. Look, it doesn't matter. Just he made a dismissive gesture in the direction of the plate. Take it back. I'll get it remade, Preston said. Over easy. I'll have it back in 4 minutes. He took the plate to the kitchen. He stood at the pass-through and told Hector over easy, and Hector nodded and made the eggs. And Preston stood there for a moment in the kitchen with his hands on the counter and his heart doing something in his chest that it didn't used to do when things like this happened, which was feel it. Actually feel the weight of the interaction, the way it sat on the person being spoken to, the way it accumulated over the course of a shift, over the course of 6 years of shifts, over the course of a working life spent absorbing the particular small cruelties that people aim at service workers because they can. He carried the plate back out. He set it in front of the man. Over easy, he said. Sorry for the confusion. The man looked at the plate. He looked at Preston. He said nothing for a moment. Then you're that kid, the Vale kid. Yes, Preston said. The man looked at the plate. He looked at Preston again, and something in his expression had changed, not softened exactly, but recalibrated, the way people recalibrate when they encounter something they didn't expect and have to decide what to do with it. The eggs are fine, the man said. Good, Preston said. Let me know if you need anything else. He moved to the next table. His heart was still doing the thing in his chest. He didn't try to make it stop. 3 tables over, a woman in her early 40s was speaking to her teenage daughter in a voice calibrated to carry the voice people use when they want to be overheard by the specific person they're performing for. Some people, she said, think an apology is enough. They do whatever they want. They say sorry, and they expect everyone to pretend it didn't happen. The daughter was looking at her phone. Preston was clearing the table next to them. He heard it. He knew it was aimed at him. He stacked the plates, picked up the tray, and walked past their table without responding. But at the end of the row, he stopped. He turned back. You're not wrong, he said. The woman looked at him. An apology isn't enough, he said. That's why I'm still here. He picked up the tray. Enjoy your breakfast. Audrey was at the counter, and she had heard the whole thing. She did not look up from what she was doing. But something in the set of her shoulders changed, eased, by a fraction. The way something eases when a weight you've been monitoring shifts slightly toward a sustainable position. Wade came in at noon that day. He didn't usually come in on Fridays, but he came in that Friday, and he sat at the counter and he ordered coffee and pie. And he watched Preston work for 20 minutes with the careful, patient attention that was his natural register. When Preston came to refill his cup, Wade said, "How are you doing?" "Tired," Preston said. "My feet don't stop hurting. I've started dreaming about coffee orders." "That's normal," Wade said. "Hector told me you've been staying 20 minutes after close to help him with the kitchen." Preston poured the coffee. "It needs doing. You don't get paid for the extra 20 minutes. "I know." Wade wrapped his hands around the cup. "A friend of mine texted me this morning. Said he came in for breakfast last week. You mixed up his order, brought him the wrong thing, and when you realized it, you brought out the right thing and told him the incorrect one was on the house and didn't put it on the ticket." Preston looked at him. "It was my mistake. You paid for it yourself," Wade said. "Out of your wages." "It was my mistake," Preston said again, as if this were a simple fact that didn't require further explanation. And the thing that Wade was reading very carefully, because he had been wrong about people before and did not take the risk of being wrong lightly. It sounded like it was simple, not performed, not constructed for an audience. Just a man who had made a mistake and understood what making a mistake meant in a way that he hadn't understood before. "There's a regular here," Wade said. "Man named Jerry. Comes in Thursday mornings, always sits at table 4, always orders the same thing. Been coming here for 31 years. "I know Jerry," Preston said. "Extra butter, the cough before the food. Leave him alone until he's halfway through." Wade looked at him for a moment. "Ruth told you that?" "Nobody told me, I watched." Preston looked at table 4. which was empty today. Jerry came on Thursdays. He reads the paper while he eats. If you interrupt before he's halfway through, he loses his place in whatever he was reading, and he gets this look, not annoyed, just like something he was holding got put down. Preston looked back at Wade. So I don't interrupt. Wade was quiet for a moment. You know why Audrey's good at this job? He said. Because she pays attention, Preston said immediately. To what? Preston thought about it. To what people actually need. Not what they say they need or what the ticket says they need. What they actually need in that specific moment. He set the coffee pot down on the counter. Jerry needs his paper. The woman at table 6 every Wednesday needs to be asked how her sister's doing before she can relax enough to order. The couple at table 9 always fights about the tip amount after the bill comes, but if you bring the check with a little extra time before you hover for it, they work it out without it becoming a thing. He stopped. He seemed to realize how much he'd said. I've been watching. I know, Wade said. Audrey told me. Preston looked at him sharply. She talks to you about me? She talks to me about how the work is going, Wade said. The work includes you. He took a drink of his coffee. She says you're showing up. Something passed across Preston's face, relief. Maybe, or the thing relief becomes when you've been afraid you weren't going to be able to do the thing that mattered and then discovered you could. It was a young expression. It was the most honest expression Wade had seen on him. I don't know if I'm doing it right, Preston said. Nobody does it right, Wade said. They just keep doing it. The conversation that happened between Preston and Mason on the 6th Saturday was not planned by either of them and was not witnessed by anyone except the motorcycle that Mason was steadily restoring and the tools arranged around it with the careful order of a craftsman who has learned to respect the workspace, because the workspace is where the real thinking happens. Preston had been assigned to the other end of the garage. That day, a carburetor rebuild that Ortega was walking him through, but Ortega had been called to the phone and Preston had finished the part he could finish and was cleaning his station when Mason said, without preamble, the timing's off on this. Preston looked over. What timing? The intake cam, Mason said. He was looking at a component with the focused frustration of a man who has found a problem he knows how to fix, but doesn't have full use of the hands that know how to fix it. I need a second pair of hands. Ortega's on the phone. Preston walked over. Mason explained what needed doing, precise, technical, the explanation of a craftsman who knows exactly what he's talking about. Preston listened without interrupting. Then he did what Mason described, with his hands in the place Mason directed, applying the pressure Mason specified. Hold, Mason said. Preston held. Mason made the adjustment. Release. Preston released. Mason sat back and checked the result. He looked at it for a long moment with the evaluating silence of an expert assessing his own work. Then he said, good. They worked in silence for another 10 minutes. Then Mason said, my father built this bike from a frame kit in 1978. I started working on it with him when I was 9. He died in 2019 and left it to me. It was about 60% done. Preston said nothing. He handed Mason the tool he could see Mason was reaching for before Mason had to ask for it. Mason took it. When I was in the hospital after the fall, he said, the first thing I thought about after Audrey, after the pain, was the Indian, whether I'd ever get the wrist back enough to finish it. He turned the tool in his hands. 40% left to do. That's a lot when your wrist doesn't close properly. Is it getting better? Preston said. Some, Mason said. The last surgery got me about 70% of the grip strength I need. The doctor says 90% is possible with another year of PT. He looked at the motorcycle. 90% might be enough. I could help, Preston said. He said it carefully, without presumption. If you need hands, I know I'm not skilled, but I can follow directions. Mason was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Preston assumed the answer was no and began to move back to his station. Next Saturday, Mason said, come in at 7. We'll start on the primary chain. Preston stopped. He turned back. 7, he said. Don't be late, Mason said, and bring your own coffee. I don't make it for volunteers. Preston almost smiled. He went back to his station and cleaned it with a thoroughness that Ortega, returning from his phone call, noted with a slight raising of an eyebrow that constituted, from Ortega, high praise. The incident that broke something open between Preston and the understanding of what he'd actually done happened in the seventh week, on a Tuesday, at the diner, in the middle of the lunch service. A group of 4 came in, 2 men, 2 women, all around Preston's age, dressed in the way that his former friends dressed. They sat at a table in his section. They were loud in the way that groups of young people with money are loud, not malicious, just untethered from the awareness that a restaurant is a shared space and the people in it have not all agreed to exist inside the volume of their conversation. One of the men, somewhere in the middle of ordering, looked at the specials board and said to his companion, with a laugh that was meant to be conspiratorial, and arrived at condescending, only in a place like this $48 steak special, right next to a laminated menu from 2009. His companion laughed. The woman across from them looked slightly uncomfortable. Preston was writing down the order. He looked at the specials board. Ruth had chalked it herself that morning at 5:15. The $48 steak was the good cut from the local ranch 3 miles east of town, which was why it cost what it cost. The laminated menu had been laminated because Ruth laminated them every few years rather than printing new ones, which was a practical and unassuming thing to do that a person would understand if they'd ever had to run a business on a real budget. The steak is from Henderson's ranch, Preston said. He kept his voice entirely even, grass-fed, local. Ruth's had the same supplier for 19 years. The price reflects the quality. He looked at the man. The laminated menu is because good restaurants focus their resources on the food. Can I get you started with drinks? There was a pause. The man who had made the comment looked at Preston with the recalibrating expression that people use when someone they dismissed turns out to have teeth. Water's fine, the man said. Of course, Preston said. He looked at the table. I'll be right back with those. He went to get the waters. At the counter, Audrey was watching him. When he came back past her with the tray, she said quietly, so only he could hear, that was well done. He looked at her. I wasn't rude? No, she said. You weren't. That's what made it well done. He carried the tray to the table. Later that afternoon, after the lunch service, when the diner had quieted to its mid-afternoon lull, and Preston was restocking the condiment stations, he thought about what he had done and what had made him do it. Not performance, not calculation, not the awareness of Audrey watching, or Wade's possible approval, or the Gazette story, or any of the external scaffolding that had surrounded the last 7 weeks. He had defended the diner because the diner deserved defending. He had defended Ruth's menu because Ruth's menu represented 41 years of a woman doing her work with integrity and deserved better than a casual dismissal from someone passing through. He had said it and meant it and moved on to the next task. He thought about the morning 7 weeks ago when he had sat in a booth in this same building and said, loud enough for the room to hear, that his father would own this block by fall and that the people who worked here should start thinking about their next employment situation, and how natural that had felt, how entirely unexamined, how baked into the software of who he was. He thought about the $50 bill he'd pushed into the coffee puddle. He thought about Audrey's face when she'd looked at it. And for the first time, without the context of being watched or corrected or held accountable by anyone else in the room, he felt the full weight of it, not as an embarrassment, not as a mistake to be corrected, but as a thing he had done to a person who did not deserve it and who had absorbed it with a dignity that was not weakness, but was, in fact, the strongest thing he had witnessed in his 24 years. He finished restocking the condiments. He tied up the trash. He swept the service area. He was still there, sweeping, when Audrey came back from the break she took in the mid-afternoon when the floor was light. She looked at him, this young man who had walked into her diner 7 weeks ago, with contempt in his posture, and a phone to document her humiliation, and a father's name to protect him from consequences, and she looked at what 7 weeks of showing up had done to the shape of him. It wasn't transformation. It was something more accurate and more durable than transformation. It was the beginning of a person who was different, not because the circumstances had changed him, but because he had chosen. Every morning to keep choosing. Preston, she said. He looked up from the broom. You don't have to stay after hours to sweep, she said. That's not part of the assignment. He looked at the broom. It needed doing, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she walked behind the counter and started the end-of-day coffee, the decaf pot that Ruth liked in the evenings, and she said, without looking at him, my brother says you've been coming in at 7 on Saturdays. He wanted the primary change started early, Preston said. He told me, Audrey said. He also told me you've been listening to him talk about the accident. What happened at the warehouse? He said you asked questions. Preston was quiet. He doesn't talk about it much, Audrey said. She measured the coffee grounds with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this particular task approximately 2,000 times. He doesn't want people to feel sorry for him, so he doesn't tell people. She poured the water. He told you. He told me because I asked, Preston said. And because. He stopped. He thought about how to say the next thing accurately. Because I needed to understand what it cost. When a company like my father's makes the decision not to fix something. When the reports go into a drawer and the beam stays in the ceiling. What it costs. He looked at the broom in his hands. It cost Mason's wrist. It cost his hip. It cost you double shifts for 2 years. It cost the Indian sitting 60% done in a garage because the man who was building it couldn't hold a wrench. He looked at Audrey. I needed to understand it wasn't abstract. Audrey was quiet for a long time. The coffee machine began its cycle, the small domestic sound of it filling the kitchen. It's not abstract, she said finally. I know, he said. I know that now. She looked at him across the counter of the Desert Rose Diner, this place that was still standing, because Graham Vale had stopped the acquisition, still serving because Ruth Mercer refused to be moved, still hers because Nora Bell had put a story in the paper, and Wade Callahan had put a lawyer's card in a man's pocket, and 17 bikers had stayed for lunch when they could have left after breakfast. What are you going to do? She said. After the 12 weeks. He didn't answer immediately. She hadn't expected him to. I've been thinking about the warehouse, he said. About the safety division. The way reports get logged and then disappear. I've been thinking about studying mechanical engineering, workplace safety, going into my father's company from the inside and rebuilding how it handles that. He paused. Not as an executive, not from the top, from the part of the company that actually touches the work. Audrey listened to this. She thought about Mason at his high stool working the Indian with 70% of the grip strength he used to have, and she thought about 3 reports sitting in a drawer. And she thought about what it would mean for the next Mason, the man or woman who filed the next report at the next facility and needed someone on the other end of that filing to actually do something with it. That's a good reason to stay, she said. He nodded. He went back to sweeping. She started wiping the counter. They worked in the quiet of the end of a long day. 2 people who had met in the worst possible way and were building something in the space where the worst of it used to be not friendship exactly, not yet, but the foundation of something that could hold weight, which is the only kind of thing worth building. Outside, the Route 66 blacktop was cooling in the late afternoon, and the light was going long and gold the way Arizona light goes in the summer evenings. And the Desert Rose Diner stood where it had stood for 41 years, and the sign in the window said open, and it meant it. The 12 weeks ended on a Tuesday. Preston knew it was the last day because he'd been counting, not with the desperate calendar watching of someone serving out a sentence, but with the particular awareness of a person who has learned to measure time differently than he used to, who has discovered that a day of honest work has a different weight and a different texture than a day of simply existing inside someone else's money. He came in at 5:30 on the dot, the same time Audrey arrived. She was already tying her apron when he walked through the door, and she looked at the clock and then at him without saying anything. And he went behind the counter and got his apron and tied it the way he'd learned to tie it, clean knot, snug, adjusted, so it didn't pull when he was carrying a loaded tray and he went to check the sanitizer. Hector was at the grill. Ruth was doing the cash drawer. Nothing was different from any other Tuesday, except that when Ruth looked up from the drawer and saw Preston, she set down her pen and said, "Sit down for a minute." He sat on the stool across from her. She looked at him the way Ruth looked at things, with the direct, unhurried assessment of a woman who has been reading people across a counter for 4 decades and is rarely surprised by what she finds, but is occasionally genuinely pleased. "Today's the last day of your 12 weeks, she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." "All right. When you leave today," she said, "what are you leaving with?" He thought about it. Not performing thought, actually thinking. The way he'd learned to think in this place, which was slowly and with full attention to the actual question rather than the answer that would sound best. "I'm leaving with calloused feet," he said. "And the knowledge that I was an instrument of something that nearly cost you your building and cost Mason 2 years of his life, and that knowing that is not the same as having fixed it, and that fixing it is the work of a much longer time than 12 weeks. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had pushed money into a coffee puddle 11 weeks ago, and they were different hands now, not in structure, but in what they'd been asked to do and what they'd learned from being asked. "And I'm leaving with the understanding that you let me stay here. And Audrey let me stay here. And that was a harder thing to give than anything my father's money could have bought." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The garage called. Wade wants you there Saturday, I know," Preston said. "I'll be there." "The 12 weeks are over," she said. "You don't have to." "I know," he said again. "I'll be there." Ruth picked up her pen and went back to the cash drawer. "Coffee's ready," she said. "Tables need setting before 6. He got up and went to work. Morning rush came in with its usual organized chaos, the regulars in their regular order. Jerry at table 4 with his paper. The contractor from the second week who had taught Preston about the toast. The woman at table 6 who needed to talk about her sister before she could settle enough to order. Preston moved through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this enough times that the doing has become its own kind of thinking, hands occupied, mind tracking, attention distributed across the room in the way that Audrey had taught him by example, and that he had absorbed through repetition the way you absorb any skill that matters, which is by doing it until it stops requiring effort and starts requiring only presence. At 9:15, a moment arrived that Preston had not prepared for, and that arrived, as significant moments tend to, in the middle of an ordinary action. He was refilling coffee at table 3 when the front door opened and Marcus walked in. Marcus, the friend who had texted him in week 4 about the Cabo trip, who had been at the diner the morning of the incident, who had laughed at the right moments and stayed quiet at the wrong ones, and who had, in the 11 weeks since, sent exactly 3 texts, all of which Preston had read, and none of which he had answered because he hadn't known to say, and had eventually understood that not knowing what to say was itself the answer. Marcus stood inside the door and looked at Preston, at the apron, at the coffee pot, at the tables, and his face went through the specific recalibration of someone encountering a reality that they have been told about, but have not until this moment believed. "Hey," Marcus said. "Hey," Preston said. He finished the refill at table 3 and looked at the room. One table needed checking. The counter had 2 new customers. Audrey was handling the window booth. He looked at Marcus. "You want breakfast?" Marcus sat at the counter. Preston brought him coffee. He checked the table that needed checking. He came back. "You actually did it," Marcus said. "The whole thing?" "Yes," Preston said. I don't know. I thought after a couple weeks you'd find a way out." "I thought about it," Preston said. "Week 4. You texted me about Cabo." Marcus wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. He looked at it. "I didn't think you'd stay," he said. "I didn't think anyone would actually stay." "I almost didn't," Preston said. He refilled the cup of the customer 2 stools down without breaking the conversation. "But I saw something that week that made me understand why I had to." "What did you see?" Preston looked at the diner, at Hector through the pass-through, at Ruth behind the counter, at the morning light coming through the windows onto the tables he'd set at 5:45. "I saw someone treat Audrey the way I treated her," he said. "Different guy, different morning. same contempt, same assumption that the job made her less than. And I saw her absorb it the same way she absorbed what I did with this steadiness. Like the contempt couldn't reach the actual person. He looked at Marcus, and I realized that steadiness isn't something she was born with. It's something she built out of necessity, because people like us kept making it necessary. He set the coffee pot down. I built nothing. I just spent 24 years standing on what other people built and telling myself the height was mine. Marcus was quiet. That's a hard thing to realize about yourself, he said finally. Yes, Preston said. It is. He picked up the coffee pot. Eggs? Hector does a good scramble. Marcus ordered eggs. Preston put in the ticket. The morning continued. The story that broke while Preston was still working his last shift came not from Nora's paper, but from a statewide investigative outlet that had picked up the Gazette story and spent 6 weeks going deeper. Nora had shared her documentation, the LLC filings, the county records, the timeline of the zoning manipulation, and the state investigation had expanded it into something larger and more damaging than a single diner's near acquisition. Colton Reese had not used the Mesa Ridge Properties strategy only on Ruth's block. He had used it on 11 separate occasions across 3 counties over 4 years, targeting small businesses and longtime property owners in corridors that Vail Development was eyeing for larger projects. The pattern was consistent: false ownership registrations, interest-bid zoning notices, manufactured compliance windows, last-minute pressure visits, timed to leave minimal response time. In 8 of the 11 cases, the property owner had sold some because they'd been told they had no choice, some because they'd been exhausted by the bureaucratic labyrinth that Colton's strategy deliberately created, and some because the compliance window had genuinely expired before they understood what was happening. 11 properties, 8 forced below-market sales, 4 years. The story went live at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning. Preston was clearing table 7 when Nora walked into the diner. She had her canvas bag and her recorder, and the particular expression of a journalist who has been awake since 4 in the morning on a story she cares about and who is running on coffee and the specific electricity of something important actually happening. She sat at the counter and ordered coffee and looked at Preston. "You've seen it," she said. "My phone's been going since 7, he said. He set the tray down and looked at her. 11 properties. 8 sold, Nora said. I know. He looked at the table he'd just cleared. He looked at Ruth's register at the specials board, in Ruth's handwriting, at the 41-year-old institutional identity of this place that had almost been one of the 8. Did my father know about the others? Nora looked at him directly. That's what the state investigation is now trying to determine, she said. His position is that Colton operated without authorization. Colton's position. She paused. Colton is cooperating with investigators. Preston was very still. What is Colton saying? He said, that he operated within a culture that prioritized acquisition metrics over methodology. Nora said. She said it carefully, the way a journalist says things that are on the record, and that certain practices were understood, even if they weren't explicitly authorized. The word understood landed in the room like a stone into still water. Preston set the tray down on the service ledge. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at Nora. I need to call my father. I know, she said. But before you do you want to tell me something? On the record. About what you know. He looked at her recorder. He thought about the first morning. About arriving in this diner with contempt in his posture and his father's name in his mouth. He thought about the document that Colton had left on Ruth's counter and the lawyer's card that Wade had produced from his jacket and Mason's voice describing 3 safety reports disappearing into a drawer. He thought about 8 property owners. He thought about 8 owners who had lost their buildings to a strategy that had operated for 4 years inside a culture that had understood. On the record, he said, I don't know the full extent of what my father authorized. I believe he didn't authorize the specific fraudulent filings. I also believe he stopped. He took a breath. I also believe that a company culture that produced Colton Reese doesn't happen by accident. It happens Because the people at the top create conditions where a Colton Reese can exist and operate and thrive. And the person at the top of Vail Development for 20 years is my father. He looked at Nora. That's what I know. Nora's pen was moving. Are you prepared for what that statement will do? She said. No, he said. But it's true. He picked up the tray. And true is the place I'm trying to start from now. He went back to work. He called his father at 11 on his break, standing outside the diner's back door in the alley where he'd been taking his breaks for 11 weeks because it was where Hector smoked. And Hector had become, in the quiet accumulation of daily proximity, someone Preston found unexpectedly easy to be honest with. Not because Hector invited confidences, but because Hector never reacted to them, just listened and went back to his cigarette. And there was something in that unstated acceptance that Preston had come to need. Graham answered on the second ring. I've read the story, Graham said. Before Preston could speak. I spoke to Nora, Preston said. On the record. I told her what I believe about the culture at the company. He waited. I needed you to know that before you read it. There was a silence on the line. Preston stood in the alley and waited for whatever was on the other side of it. What did you say? Graham asked. Preston told him, word for word. He didn't soften it. He didn't add context that would make it easier to hear. He had spent 11 weeks learning to say true things directly, and this was the most important true thing he had said, and he owed it to his father to say it the same way. Graham was quiet for a long time after he finished. I'm going to speak with the investigators today, Graham said. Voluntarily. Full cooperation. Another pause. I want you to come, not as a family member, as someone who can tell them what you observed from outside the company structure. I'll come, Preston said. Preston. His father's voice had something in it that Preston had not heard before, not the controlled severity of the man who had arrived at the diner in a black SUV to manage a situation, but something underneath that, something older and less defended. What I said to you that morning, in the diner, about making you this way, I remember, Preston said. I've been thinking about it every day since. So have I, Preston said. Do you believe it, that I made you this way? Preston looked at the back wall of the alley. He thought about the honest answer, which was complex, and he chose to give the complex answer because that was the only kind that was worth giving. I think you created a world around me where the worst parts of me never had to answer for anything, he said. And I chose, inside that world, to become the worst parts rather than the better ones. Because it was easier. Because nothing stopped me. He was quiet for a moment. I think we both have a share of it. And I think the share that's mine is the one I have to carry. Graham said, I'm proud of you. Preston hadn't expected it. He didn't know what to do with it immediately. So he held it the way you hold something fragile carefully, without gripping. I'll see you at the investigator's office, he said. What time? 2 o'clock. I'll be there. He went back inside and finished his shift. Graham Vail's voluntary cooperation with the state investigation was announced that afternoon and produced a secondary wave of coverage that Nora navigated with the focused precision of a journalist who has been working a story for 3 months and knows exactly which pieces still need to be placed. The cooperation included full disclosure of the acquisition strategy documents, the internal communications related to Colton Reese's methods, and this was the part that mattered most to the 8 property owners who had already sold a commitment to an independent review of every below-market transaction connected to the Mesa Ridge property strategy. It was not justice. It was the beginning of the process by which justice becomes possible, which is different and slower and less satisfying, but more durable. Wade received the news from Nora's text at 2:15 on Tuesday afternoon. He was at the garage, working on a transmission, and he read the text and set his phone down and went back to the transmission. Because the transmission needed finishing, and the news was good, but it didn't change what needed doing next. Cole across the shop said, "What was that?" Graham Vail is cooperating with the state investigation, Wade said. Full disclosure. Cole was quiet for a moment. Because of the kid? Because of a lot of things, Wade said. The kid is one of them. Cole went back to his work. After a minute, he said, "You think he'll stick?" Preston. After it's all done. Wade thought about the question with the careful attention he gave to questions that mattered. I think he's discovered that showing up every day is the only thing that answers that question, Wade said. And I think he knows it. The charity ride happened on a Saturday in October, 4 months after the morning that had started everything. The Hells Angels organized it the same way they organized their rides, with the practical efficiency of people who have been doing something long enough to do it well, and with the minimum of ceremony. The fundraiser was for injured workers and independent roadside businesses, which was a cause that had acquired specific and personal weight for everyone who showed up, and they showed up in numbers that surprised even Wade, who had been doing this long enough to have calibrated his expectations realistically. Ruth made the coffee. Audrey worked the counter. Hector ran the kitchen at full capacity, which was a thing he did with the calm authority of a man who loves his work and is at his best when it asks the most of him. Mason was there. He arrived at 7:30 early, walking with the gait that was still careful, but had improved measurably over the past 4 months the PT was working. The grip was approaching 85%, and he had finished the Indians' primary chain 3 Saturdays ago, with Preston's hands doing the work his couldn't quite manage. And the experience had produced between the two of them something that neither of them had a precise name for, but that functioned, in practice, like mutual respect that had been built out of mutual honesty, which is the only kind worth having. The Indian was not finished yet, but it ran. Mason had started it for the first time 2 Saturdays ago, and the sound it made the specific voice of an engine that has been rebuilt with care and patience and the accumulated knowledge of every mistake made and corrected along the way was the best sound Mason had heard in 4 years, and he had sat on the stool in the garage and put his hand on the tank and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. Preston arrived at the diner at 5:30. Nobody had asked him to. He came because the event needed hands, and he had hands, and because this place and these people had become the place and the people he showed up for, which was not a decision he had made on a single morning, but a fact he had discovered through the accumulated evidence of showing up every morning. He worked the event the way he worked every shift present, attentive, moving through the room with the particular calibrated awareness that Audrey had modeled and that he had absorbed through repetition until it was no longer a performance of attentiveness but the real thing. He refilled coffee. He cleared tables. He answered questions from people who recognized him from the story and asked him about his father's investigation, and he answered those questions honestly and briefly and without drama, and then moved to the next table. Wade found him in the mid-morning, during a relative lull, at the end of the counter. "How are you doing?" Wade said. "Good," Preston said. "Feet feel fine." That took longer than I expected. Wade almost smiled. "Your father, the 8 property owners. How's that going?" Preston had been involved in the review process not as a legal representative, but as someone who could speak to the operational context of the acquisitions. It was uncomfortable work, sitting across from people who had lost something because of a system his family had built, and watching them describe what the loss cost them. He didn't try to make it comfortable. He sat with it and listened, and said what was true when he was asked direct questions. 3 settlements finalized, he said. 5 more in process. The independent reviewer thinks fair market compensation is achievable in all 8 cases. He looked at the counter. It doesn't give them back the time. It doesn't give back the businesses that closed because they had to sell. But it's something real. It is, Wade said. The warehouse safety division, Preston said. My father approved the restructuring proposal last week. I'm starting in January. Entry level, not executive. I'm going to have to earn every position above that. Wade looked at him. You're sure that's what you want? I'm sure it's what needs doing, Preston said. Whether it's what I want is a question I'll figure out along the way. That seems like the honest version. Wade reached into his jacket pocket. He produced a coin, not large, the size of a $50, worn at the edges in the way of something carried for a long time. On one side was the Hells Angels emblem. On the other side were 3 words that Preston couldn't read from the angle Wade was holding it. Wade set it on the counter between them. This isn't membership, Wade said. You don't earn membership with 12 weeks of good behavior. Membership is a different conversation for a different time, and it's not mine to offer alone. He looked at the coin. This is something I give to people who have earned the right to be reminded of something. He looked at Preston directly. Turn it over. Preston picked up the coin. He turned it over. The 3 words on the back read, stand beside, not on. He held it for a long moment. I know what I did, he said. I know you do, Wade said. That's why the coin means something. He picked up his coffee. A man who doesn't know what he did carries it as a trophy. A man who does know carries it as a compass. He looked at Preston. Use it as a compass. Preston closed his hand around the coin. The moment that arrived next was the one he had thought about since the first week, the conversation he hadn't known how to approach, and that he had been building toward, not consciously, but inevitably. Through every honest exchange and every corrected mistake and every morning of showing when he could have stopped. He found Audrey at 11:15 between the breakfast rush and the lunch crowd, the brief interlude when the diner breathed. She was at the end of the counter with a cup of coffee she'd poured for herself, something she did once per shift, a small claim of time in a day that otherwise belonged entirely to everyone else. Can I talk to you? He said. She looked at him. Yes. He had thought about what to say for several days and had decided, finally, to say it without rehearsal, because rehearsal was the version designed for an audience, and this was not for an audience. This was only for her. I came into this diner 4 months ago, he said, and I looked at you and I decided you were less than me. Not because of anything you said or did, because of your apron, because of the job. He kept his eyes on hers and did not look away, because looking away was the version that protects the speaker, and he owed her the version that protected nothing. I targeted you. The way I treated you wasn't incidental to what I was. It was the exact expression of what I was. Someone who confused having power over people with being better than them. Audrey held her coffee cup in both hands and listened. I can't take it back, he said. I know that. I'm not asking you to erase it or pretend it was something smaller than it was. It was what it was. He looked at the counter between them. I'm asking you to know that I understand it, the full weight of it, not as an embarrassment to manage or a reputation problem to fix, as a thing I did to a person who deserved none of it. He looked up at her. You held yourself together in front of a room full of people, and you did it with more dignity than I have ever had in my life. And I filmed it. I filmed it because I wanted to make you small, and I thought your job made you small enough that I could. He stopped. I was wrong about everything. Everything except this. You are the strongest person I have met in my life. And I knew it that morning, before I ever picked up my phone, and that's why I picked it up. Because strength like yours frightened me, and I didn't know any other response to fear except to try to diminish what caused it. The diner was quiet around them. Not entirely empty, there were customers. There was the sound of the kitchen, but quiet in the way that a space becomes quiet when something real is happening inside it. Audrey set her coffee cup down. She looked at Preston Vale, at this young man who had arrived in her diner as one thing and had spent 4 months in the increments of early mornings and aching feet and small, honest choices, becoming something else. And she felt the full complexity of what she felt, which was not simple and was not clean and was not the neat narrative resolution of a person who has been wronged receiving a satisfying apology. It was something more honest than that. It was the experience of watching someone build something real from the rubble of who they used to be, and understanding that the building is never finished and the rubble never entirely disappears, and deciding that the watching and the building both matter anyway. I hear you, she said. I know it's not enough. I hear you, she said again, gently but firmly, the way she said things when she meant them to land cleanly. What I'm going to say is this. My forgiveness is not the proof that you changed. The proof is what you do after today. The proof is January, when you start at the bottom of your father's safety division and someone above you tells you something is too expensive to fix. The proof is what you do with that. She looked at him steadily. It will happen. Someone will hand you a report and tell you to lose it. And in that moment, everything you've learned in this diner and in that garage either matters or it doesn't. She picked up her coffee cup. That's when I'll know. That's when you'll know. Preston nodded. He did not push for more, because more was not what she owed him. What she'd given him was enough, more than enough. More than he had expected, and exactly what was true, which was the most she could give and the only thing he actually needed. Thank you, he said. Go fill table 6, she said. Jerry's asking for a refill. He went and filled table 6. Jerry looked up from his paper long enough to nod, which was the highest expression of approval in Jerry's register. And Preston accepted it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has learned to measure gratitude in the small, specific currency of daily things done right. The afternoon settled into itself. The fundraiser continued. Money was raised enough to cover emergency repairs for 3 veteran-owned businesses along the corridor, enough to contribute to Mason's ongoing PT costs, enough to matter in the specific practical way that matters when people you know are the ones it helps. At 2 o'clock, Graham Vale walked into the Desert Rose Diner. He had not been back since the morning everything changed. He came in quietly, without the SUV or the jacket, or the authority he'd worn like a second skin on that first visit. He wore a plain shirt, and he moved without the weight of performance. And Ruth looked at him from behind the counter with the assessing expression of a woman deciding what something means. He walked to the counter. He sat down on the stool that had been his son's stool for 4 months. Coffee? Ruth said. Please, he said. She poured it. She set it in front of him. She looked at him. The building, he said. He reached into his pocket and produced an envelope, which he set on the counter between them. Deed of transfer. Fair market value, cash sale, no conditions, no reversionary clauses. It's yours. It was always yours. Ruth looked at the envelope. She didn't pick it up immediately. Why? She said, not suspiciously, just directly, the way Ruth asked everything. Because I built a company that did something with this building that I would not have authorized if I'd been paying attention, Graham said. And not paying attention is not the same as innocence. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, the same gesture his son had used at this counter 4 months ago, which Ruth noticed and which she thought she might mention to Audrey later. And because your diner has been on this street since before I had anything worth calling a company, and it deserves to stay on this street long after I'm gone. Ruth picked up the envelope. She opened it. She read the first page with the careful attention of a woman who has signed enough documents to know the difference between a real transfer and a conditional one. She looked up. This is real. Yes, he said. She put the document back in the envelope. She held it for a moment. Then she said, thank you. No, Graham said. Thank you. For staying, for not selling when they pressured you. He looked at his coffee. And for what you did with my son. I didn't do anything with your son, Ruth said. He did something with himself. We just didn't stop him. Graham was quiet for a moment. He drank his coffee. He looked around the diner at the license plates on the wall, at the ceiling fans, at the specials board in Ruth's handwriting, at the ordinary functional beauty of a place that has been doing its job with integrity for 41 years. It's a good diner, he said. It's the best diner, Ruth said, with the certainty of a woman who has earned the right to that opinion. Graham almost smiled. He paid for his coffee. He stood up. At the door, he stopped and looked back. Preston was across the room, carrying a full tray, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who has found the work and decided to stay inside it. He was talking to a customer, laughing at something. The customer said, a real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of a person who is present in the moment they're in rather than performing presence from somewhere else. Graham watched his son for a moment. He walked out. The motorcycles gathered in the late afternoon, in the parking lot outside the Desert Rose Diner for the return leg of the charity ride. 17 bikes, the same 17 that had been here 4 months ago, plus 6 more from neighboring chapters who joined for the fundraiser. They started up in sequence, the sound of them building into the particular thunder that is the sound of a community moving together. And Wade mounted last, as road captain, and looked back at the diner once before pulling out. Audrey was standing in the doorway. He nodded at her. She nodded back. Then he pulled out, and the motorcycles of the Hells Angels took Route 66 west. into the late afternoon light, and the sound of them carried across the flat Arizona terrain for longer than seemed possible, hanging in the air like something that refuses to entirely leave, and then it was gone. Preston was behind the counter when the last of the sound faded. He was washing cups, the ordinary end-of-shift task that nobody asked him to stay for, and that he stayed for anyway, because the cups needed washing, and he was still there, and those two facts were sufficient. Audrey came in from the doorway. She tied her apron. She picked up a towel. They worked side by side in the quiet of the diner at the end of a long day. And outside, the Route 66 blacktop stretched in both directions, east into everything that had happened, west into everything that was still coming, and the Desert Rose Diner was open. And the sign in the window said so, and it had been saying so for 41 years, and it would keep saying so. Preston once walked into this diner, believing that the only currency that mattered was the one his father had given him. He left it understanding something that no amount of money had ever managed to teach him, that the only respect worth having is the kind you earn in the daily, unglamorous, entirely ordinary act of treating every person in every room as someone who deserves to be there, and that the earning never stops, and it was never supposed to stop. And the day you believe it's finished is the day you become, again, the person you once were. He would not become that person again. He had paid too much to learn why.